And my name's Brian Potts. I am honored to be moderating the 9th annual Vermont Law School Alumni and Energy Symposium. I was here at the first annual Alumni and Energy Symposium. I don't know if the idea started with Dan Phillips, but a classmate of mine, Dan Phillips, I think met with Kevin and had the great idea to do this event and called me up. And so I was involved right from the beginning. I think my formal title is consigliere to the Alumni and Energy Group. And Dan is out of town and wasn't available to be here today. So I was lucky enough to be, the leftovers. I love Vermont Law School. I've graduated in 2004. And at the time I graduated, there was no energy program at Vermont Law School. I have this distinct memory of a guy named Chris talking about energy a lot and me sort of not knowing what he was talking about. And fast forward, and now I know a lot more about what he was talking about and probably should have paid more attention to, I called him Energy Chris back then. This is a wonderful event. I hope everyone enjoys it as much as I have over the years. I know we have close to 100 people signed up online. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to President Smolla, who I've had the chance to meet once and was very impressed with. You'll have to prove that up now.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Brian, or if you want to be called consigliere, I'm happy to do that. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it to the symposium, but the consigliere called me and he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I am here. It's my pleasure as the president of the Vermont Law and Graduate School to welcome you all, to thank our hosts, to thank all the organizers, all the participants, all the panelists for your willingness to be here today and talk about this extraordinary series of topics. Although not one of the actual panel discussion topics listed for today's afternoon, I'm reflecting on the extent to which any discussion today on matters relating to energy and policy cannot help but have brooding as an omnipresence in the sky above it the huge forces around the world, and here in the United States that are currently at loose, that are possibly going to transform so much of this world that we live in. There's first war, the extraordinarily aggressive brutality of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which not only has taken a huge toll in human life, but has disrupted the world's energy markets and caused major rethinking of how we power the world in Europe and elsewhere. And here in the United States, although we'll be talking about this summer's legislation and recent developments, that whole world of legislating on matters relating to energy, the environment, any aspect of American life, has against its backdrop the extraordinary changes in American constitutional and administrative law being worked by the new United States Supreme Court. The landscape is possibly going to change in dramatic ways that affect about 2/3 of the buildings within 5 miles of us here in the District of Columbia. The first inklings of this began a few years ago when a number of conservative justices suggested that perhaps the orthodoxy that had reigned in American constitutional law since the New Deal, dealing with an obscure constitutional doctrine known as the non-delegation doctrine, should be rethought. The baseline rule, the truism, has historically been that Congress may not delegate its legislative authority to other branches of government. But the modern nation has been built on the opposite of that theory. So that rule has been honored in the breach since the New Deal, since the court that obstructed the early efforts of President Roosevelt in the New Deal. The Supreme Court has essentially paid no attention to the non-delegation doctrine. The last case to deal with it was called the Schechter poultry case, the sick chicken case, in the early days of the New Deal, in which many parts of what were agricultural reforms to try to get the country out of the Depression were struck down. And in place of the rule that you cannot delegate your legislative authority, the Supreme Court invented what was called the intelligible principle doctrine, which is as long as there is an intelligible principle, an intelligible guideline, you can delegate vast authority to administrative agencies. But intelligible principle turned out to mean almost nothing. A principle as broad as go regulate this area of the economy or social life in the public interest was intelligible enough. But a few years ago, a number of the conservative Supreme Court justices suggested that that should be rethought. And instead, Congress should be forced, if it's going to delegate authority to administrative agencies, to do so with specificity. And it could not yield its legislative authority to experts that would run the many, many agencies that are housed within miles of us and that have such a huge impact on our life. And then, of course, this summer, not a constitutional law ruling as much as an administrative law ruling, the Supreme Court in EPA versus West Virginia held that the decisions involving energy by the Environmental Protection Agency were beyond the organic statutory authority that Congress had created for the agency when it enacted the Clean Air Act. And it invented, arguably, a doctrine very much like the non-delegation doctrine, the major question doctrine, which is that if there are major questions of public policy, such as should you shift energy away from carbon-producing sources to other sources, Congress has to make that policy choice. Congress can't give that over to an agency. Those are two powerful notions, and if they take hold and gain traction, it could alter the world that many of you live in. And change the arenas in which you try to get wiser policy from the courts to other arenas. In any event, I am not an energy lawyer, not an energy expert, but naturally curious. I'm very proud of this school's extraordinary history in this field, of all of our alumni that have taken consequential roles as policymakers and lawyers in this world. I'll be enjoying listening to everybody. And with that, I will turn matters over to our congenial host of the first panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Jennifer Murphy. I'm Director of Energy Policy and Senior Counsel at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, casually known as NARUC. I'm going to invite my panelists to come up and join me. Don't be so far away. Come on up. You're at the end, Eric. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for, I'm just going to start my moderator duties of keeping time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today here at the symposium, and in particular for this panel. Thank you, President Smolla, for giving us a national perspective to think about while we go through this discussion. We're going to go a little deeper, and we're going to talk about things on the state level. And we have an excellent set of speakers here today to talk about an important, timely topic, namely how states can work together to create greater synergy with their climate actions. Our panelists represent academia, state government, industry, and are going to give us a well-rounded view of the issues that are pertain to this topic. I'm going to briefly introduce them because their full bios are in the conference materials, and then we're going to let them tell us a little bit more about what they do. So first, I'm going to start with Autumn Proudlove. She is the Associate Director of Policy Markets at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center at North Carolina State University. Thank you for joining us, Autumn. And she is also Merle, class of 2013. So Autumn, some of us are familiar with your center's work through the DESIRE, which is the, I had to write it down, database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency. This is something you've actually come and spoke to my commissioners about several times. For those of us who aren't familiar with what the work of your center, could you describe what you all do and sort of the research you're conducting?
Yeah, absolutely. So the NC Clean Energy Technology Center is a public service center within NC State University. We focus really on providing objective research, analysis, education, and technical assistance related to clean energy technologies, practices, and policies. So we don't do any sort of advocacy work. We work, very hard to remain neutral and to be that sort of trusted source of information in the industry. So as Jennifer mentioned, my team manages the Desire database, which is a comprehensive public database of all the policies and incentives that are currently available for renewables, efficiency, storage, electric vehicles at the federal, state, and utility levels. So it's really a massive amount of information that can otherwise be really challenging to find and to understand, especially for our homeowner audience that's really just out there looking for incentives. So if you do want to check out the website, it's dsireusa.org. Just make sure to be careful with that URL. Now, in recent years, we've expanded on this to track policy changes that are currently under consideration through what we call Desire Insight. So we're really deep in the weeds of state legislation and regulatory dockets, but we have a unique vantage of analyzing what's happening across the entire country. So given the work that my team and I do, I did want to open up with just a few big high-level state clean energy policy trends that we're seeing. I don't know if we have a few slides.
Yes, I'm trying to contact someone to get us the slides subtly. I guess maybe not so much so. Brian, do you have the slides available by chance?
Someone should have the clicker. There should be a little black clicker. Yeah.
Got it. There we go.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. I don't want to get too far ahead. Okay. So
Oops, back to green.
oh no. There's a little bit of a delay. Okay, got it. So the first trend I wanted to mention was states setting targets for power sector decarbonization. So these are things like renewable portfolio standards, clean energy standards, and greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. We're seeing states adopt new targets, but also increasing the percentages and moving up the timelines for their existing mandates and goals. So this map here shows RPS and clean energy standards specifically. While there's a general trend of adopting more aggressive targets, you can see that states are still very much taking their own approaches with different targets and timelines, different eligible resources, even things like technology carve-outs and credit multipliers in there. And then you also have some states that have no targets at all. So it is a bit of a patchwork right now. And then there's also been a growing focus on sort of the end results and the end goals of these policies, which is frequently reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of states have been adopting these now emission reduction targets in addition to, or maybe in lieu of, a more traditional RPS policy. So for example, North Carolina, they have a relatively low RPS, you can see, but they also have a target for power sector to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, another sort of big picture policy trend that we've seen has been promoting transportation electrification. So this, in combination with that power sector decarbonization, really has the potential to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this map here shows state and utility activity on transportation electrification from all of last year. And I can tell you it's already substantially increased this year from what we've seen. So this encompasses a lot of different specific policy approaches. You've got requiring state fleet procurements to be electric vehicles, requiring parking lots to have a certain percentage of their spaces be wired for EV charging. There's, creating special rate structures for EV charging, offering rebates and other incentives. So I think, again, here you see that there are a lot of different policy approaches with the same overarching objective that states are aiming toward. Now, another trend that really follows on from these first two is grid modernization. So in order to integrate the growing amounts of renewable energy that we're seeing and to improve things like resilience in the face of climate impacts, there's going to be a need for investments in the distribution grid. This can be a very costly thing, though, and utilities that are operating under a more traditional business model are sometimes said to have an incentive to gold plate the grid. So states have been doing a lot of planning on grid modernization to make sure that the investment is being done in a smart way that's aligned with state policy goals. Then another trend that we've been seeing has been states working to reform their traditional utility business models. So this might seem a bit more in the weeds than some of the other trends, but I promise it's exciting, and it's important because utilities aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So aligning utility incentives and therefore their actions with the public interest and with state policy will go a long way. So one really popular approach has been moving toward performance-based regulation with incentive mechanisms that are actually tied to state policy goals. Then there's also been a lot of recent movement toward regional wholesale markets, which could potentially offer some cost savings and allow for greater market participation and competition. And I don't have a good map for my last trend here, but it is an important one, and that's focusing on inclusion of low-income and underserved communities. So states have been trying a lot of different policy and program design mechanisms out to ensure that clean energy benefits are reaching these communities as well. So some of these different strategies have been, authorizing community solar with carve-outs for LMI customers, offering higher incentive levels for LMI customers for things like electric vehicles. There's sometimes build discounts or special rates for LMI customers. So there's a whole array of different solutions being tested out right now. So I think you might have gathered from all of this that the common thread from all of these trends really is that states are taking very different approaches. While this obviously poses its challenges to the industry, I think it also does offer a lot of opportunity for innovation and for states to learn from each other while all kind of working toward these same overall goals. So those are my opening trends here, and happy to answer any questions later.
Great, thank you very much. And what energy nerd doesn't love utility business model reform? I mean,
yeah,
come on.
I know, it's so exciting.
That is exciting. Next, we're going to turn to David Lapp. He is the People's Counsel for the state of Maryland. And while he is not a Swan, he is a hometown favorite for the local area, University of Maryland, go Terps. And I don't know what year, but we'll just leave that for people's research. So David, most people know what most people who are in the utility regulatory space know what a consumer advocate does, but not everyone who practices climate and energy law is necessarily working at the state regulatory level. So could you describe what your office does? And also, I think your office may have a unique statutory authority that other consumer advocates don't, and that you were able to take into consideration your state's climate policies. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate it. The state consumer advocate offices, including Maryland, my state, our state is actually one of the oldest in the country. It was created in 1924. And the whole idea behind those offices is that utilities would go before state regulatory commissions, public service commissions, they're called different things in different states, and say propose a rate increase for something. And the commission's job is to evaluate that. And there's a long history of people feeling that the state commissions were getting sort of a lopsided view of things, and there wasn't an advocacy perspective like you would have in court. So our office and a lot of states created these consumer advocate offices. So our office has historically gotten involved in those rate cases. And historically, it's been largely rate cases. And we do discovery, and we put on our own experts and all that sort of thing to push back and help make sure the commission gets it right. So we're generally in opposition to the utility, but Autumn talked about neutrality. we try and get it right. We're not there just to oppose any rate increase because we don't like rate increases, but we want to get the answer right. What does the utility need to operate and perform effectively? And as time has gone on, state public utility commissions have gotten involved in more and more things. And if any of you are involved in them today, you know, there's a whole slew of things, activities that regulatory commissions are involved in outside of just setting rates and rate cases. There's, you know, for a long time, there's been energy efficiency programs. Now there's electric vehicles, there's distribution planning, there's all kinds of things. And so over time, our office has gotten more and more involved in those activities. And what Jennifer was referring to is I'm somewhat new. I'm appointed by the Attorney General of Maryland, confirmed by the Senate. I started my term in January of 2021. And actually a little before I started, I heard from a delegate in the Maryland General Assembly who sent me some draft legislation. And it was, our office is the Office of People's Counsel. I'm the People's Counsel. And this delegate wanted to put forward legislation to create an office of climate counsel. And this legislature had been a little bit frustrated with my predecessor, or so he said. I don't know how legitimate that was, but felt that we were pushing consumer interests and disregarding environmental interests. And so he wanted to create sort of almost a competing office in this legislation. And I thought, wow, that's crazy. We need to get consumer interests and environmental interests aligned. They should be the same. And my primary statutory obligation is to protect the interests of residential customers. And I thought, well, residential customers need to be protected from environment. They need to have a planet to live on as well. And so I gradually started engaging with this delegate and expressing, that belief that these two different, sometimes competing policies really need to be incorporated in the same, because the Public Service Commission has to make decisions that are consistent with consumer interests as well as environmental interests. And eventually, we ended up with a much streamlined version of a statute that amended our statute. And so our statute now says that in performing our functions to protect residential customers, we have to take into account the state's climate policy and environmental goals. So we're still, just over, about a year into that. I was able to get, we retain experts for Public Service Commission and FERC, federal proceedings. We were able to get in there that we can hire environmental experts to help meet that part of the statute. I was also able to get some expanded budget money for the office, which is desperately needed. We're still vastly underfunded relative to the utilities. But so I've enjoyed, it's been a challenge, but I've really enjoyed the last year and a half as we've tried to, make a concerted effort to expand the role of the office. Now, to be clear, I told the delegate that I thought these things were all part of the protecting residential customers regardless. I sort of took the position that, yeah, we can put it in the statute, but I'm going to do this anyway. But I also thought, well, this is a good opportunity to expand our budget, to maybe get a few more people in here and to be able to take on more, because as the Public Service Commission has taken on a greater and greater role in Maryland, and this is also happening in other states, the General Assembly, the legislature just gives the Public Service Commission more and more responsibility. And that means more and more responsibility for our office. And often when legislatures do that, they forget that takes people and resources. And so I was able to get more people and those resources. Our office is really, we have a mandate we have two separate parts of our mandate. One is to where utilities or some party comes before the commission and asks the commission to do something. If we determine that we are needed to protect residential customers, we participate in those proceedings. But what I think is the more important part of our statute is the provision that says that we shall investigate and initiate proceedings before the Public Service Commission where we find that they are necessary to protect the interests of residential utility customers. So I've really been focusing my office on where can we actually go in, and rather responding to what the utilities are doing, we're trying to go in and get ahead of them and, file, a petition to initiate a rulemaking, for example, or to file a complaint against the utility to address different matters. One example, I was in circuit court this morning. We filed a complaint against a gas utility, Washington Gas. Some of you may be familiar with it. They had this environmental, gas is clean, convert your all electric home to gas. And, it's the equivalent of planting trees and driving fewer miles. And it's great for the environment, great for your wallet. We filed a complaint and said, effectively, this is greenwashing. But, so that's one example of something that we did affirmatively. And it's, consistent with a customer interest, because we don't think customers should be making decisions, to buy a gas furnace to have for 20 years when that may not be in either their economic interest or in the climate's interest. So that's one example of something we did. The commission dismissed it, unfortunately, but that's what I was in court to appeal. Hopefully that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and
a little bit about, yeah.
And I'm very grateful. He warned me ahead of time that he may not make it for the panel because he was going to be in court. So I'm very happy. I'm sorry for the outcome, but I'm very happy that it can.
Well, we don't have a decision from the court
okay.
yet.
Yeah, all right.
We are appealing the commission's dismissal.
The commission's
yeah.
Okay. Well, I can't talk poorly about the commission. That would be bad form for me. But I'm happy that you were able to join us. So next, we're going to turn to Eric, who I think also has a slide. You have the clicker?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Great. So Eric Wilkinson, JD, MSEL from 1996. Thank you, fellow Swan. He is the government affairs lead for electricity markets at Ørsted North America. Eric, as a developer of offshore wind and other onshore renewables, could you provide us with an overview of what Ørsted's operations are and their approach to renewable development?
Sure, and thank you, Jennifer, for moderating this panel, and thanks to all the VLS folks who helped put this together. It's always great to be together with the greater VLS diaspora, and it's wonderful to see people in person now after the pandemic. Yeah, when you first introduced me, you said there was industry representative on the panel, and I kind of looked around like, where? Because most of my career, I did graduate in 96, which is a while ago, 1996. I'd like to tell my children who have only passing knowledge of the last century. But most of my career has been in the federal government, state government, and nonprofits. So I've been with Ørsted almost 3 years now, so I still don't feel fully like an industry representative, but here I am. And I'm actually pretty proud to work for Ørsted. It's an interesting company. It's got an interesting name. It's got this interesting little weird O with a line through it. I don't know if anyone watched the 60 Minutes episode a couple of weeks ago. You're probably all too young to watch 60 Minutes, but they did a little segment about Ørsted, and the Danes, the Brits, and the Americans all pronounce it wildly differently, but we just go with that. That's how we roll. It's better than the previous name, which was Dong Energy, which stood for the Danish oil and natural gas company. But when they decided maybe we should look into North America to expand, they jettisoned that name for, I think, obvious reasons. So we are Ørsted now. Why they chose Ørsted is a little bit beyond me. But Ørsted is headquartered in Copenhagen. It's an interesting story. It was oil and gas. They're a utility in Denmark. They used to own fossil coal. And they decided no, we're not going to continue on with the fossil world. We're going to go to a completely green portfolio. So that's the transition we've been on. We're almost there. We are the world's largest developer of offshore wind, and that's probably what we're most known for. We've got 7.5 gigawatts spinning right now around the world, mostly in Europe, but also in Asia, a little tiny bit here. We've got another almost 4 gigawatts under construction right now. We built the world's first offshore wind farm back in 1996 called Vindeby, coast of Denmark. We built and own the largest offshore wind farm in the world. It's called Hornsea 2 off the coast of the UK. And we own the only offshore wind farm here in North America, a little Block Island facility, which is 5 tiny little 6 megawatt turbines on it. Maybe some of you have seen that. But we've got about 5 gigawatts under contract here in North America now, primarily on the East Coast. So that's coming in future years. Construction has started on some of those projects and a lot more to come. We also do onshore wind or land-based wind, excuse me, as we call it now, and solar and storage. We've got a lot of projects in Texas and SPP down the spine of the country, looking to California in years to come. And we also are very interested in what we call P2X, sort of power to hydrogen or some other molecule. We've got an agreement now with Maersk, another Danish company. They own a lot of shipping, major shipping company. They're going to switch over a dozen or so of their ships to burn clean methane, which we can produce through electrolyzers using solar and wind power to create green energy, to split water, take hydrogen, a fuel that they can use in shipping. So that's something we're also very interested in, and I think we're sort of on the very entry level, but a very hugely potential growth area. We are headquartered in Boston. I came down yesterday. We do have a small office here in DC, so I was able to see that. Offices in New York and are in North Carolina, and we're expanding pretty rapidly. When I started, I think there was about 100 employees 3 years ago, and now we're going to pass 700 employees in North America this year. It's a little bit like a startup. Every day I go into the office, there's 10 new people who I've never seen before. So it's exciting, and it's also a little bit odd, but it's been a great run so far. That's just a little bit about what I explained. So looking forward to this conversation and answering any questions. So thank you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now that we know what you all do and who you are, we're going to dive into what you think about these issues. But before that, I just want to let the audience here in the room know, and those online, that we will be taking audience questions. As a law school event, I feel like that should give me, the moderator, the ability to cold call on people, but I think in the hybrid environment that may not work so well. So if you are online, you should put your questions into the chat, and somehow they will magically, I think, get to me somehow. I don't know. I've been promised that. And I will pause at some point and actually look at the people gathered here, your smiley faces, and take questions directly. So, okay, so we're going to dive into our discussion. So our discussion today talks about states working together on climate actions. But I think we need to say, is there an issue? Are there regulatory and policy barriers that are slowing down the deployment of clean energy? So what's going on now? Why do they need to work together? And I think, Autumn, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think there's certainly some benefits of working together and creating some sort of consistency. I'm sure that's very helpful for developers and places, where that sort of collaboration makes a lot of sense. But also at the same time, from what you've gathered from my presentation, states are taking different approaches. They're testing out lots of different new policy designs and program models. So I think there are, a lot of benefits to that as well in, actually taking kind of the opposite approach and doing their own thing in some ways. So, states, they have different resources available to them. They have different economies, different geographies. So, customizing these policies, I think, does make sense to an extent. And then there's an opportunity to watch what everyone else is doing. And states definitely do watch what everyone else is doing. They learn from each other. I'm sure you see that a lot.
Yes.
Being at NARUC, we get a lot of requests for our research because states want to know, what are their neighbor states or what are their peer states doing, and trying to get ideas from them. So I think there is a lot of value to that approach. And then, as far as the policy barriers go, there's a lot of value in learning from each other in order to find ways to address these barriers that are slowing down deployment in some ways. I think one really good analogy that I heard last week at a conference was that the IRA that just passed is pretty much, just a whole bunch of carrots. But to harvest those carrots, you have to weed the garden. And a lot of those weeds are, state policy and regulatory issues. And I think, some of the really big ones as far as broad scale renewable energy deployment are going to be transmission, interconnection, and then local land use and siting issues. That's what we've been hearing are kind of the top issues that need to be addressed in order for deployment to move forward. So there are things that states can do on that, model ordinances, appropriate decommissioning rules, having transparency to the interconnection process. And then I'll just add at more of the distributed scale too, there are also barriers and issues that need to be worked through, providing appropriate compensation and certainty to DER developers, and allowing for participation actually in these markets where sometimes DERs aren't actually able to play in the game.
Great. Eric or David, do you want to add to what you see as the regulatory or policy barriers?
Sure. People probably know DERs, but just
Right, sorry, acronym soup.
Distributed energy resources, and I definitely agree with everything Autumn just said. There's a lot of barriers to getting those, moving those forward. But just to focus a second on sort of the regional issues that I could talk about. Barriers within the state of Maryland. Even Maryland is one of the more aggressive states in terms of climate goals, but whether Maryland can get there, because it's one thing to set an ambitious goal, it's a whole nother thing to actually achieve it. And there are lots of barriers within the state of Maryland that are pushing up against Maryland's aggressive goals. And I could talk about those for a long time, but to talk more about some of the options for working with other states, which I understand that, the topic here, and transmission, which Autumn touched on, I think is one of the big issues, because we have, a state like Maryland, or, a state with aggressive climate goals. We might see a benefit in we need transmission to move offshore wind, but that may mean a state or maybe we're trying to get wind from the Midwest. That might be the better example. Lots of wind resources in the Midwest, but it has to pass through Ohio to get to Maryland, and maybe other states, Pennsylvania, and those states say, we don't want that transmission on our property, or we don't want to help pay for it, and that can be a pretty significant hurdle to Maryland, where we have fewer resources for, say, land-based wind. We have aggressive climate goals, but right now our resource mix, we buy it all through the regional pool, PJM, which is not all that clean. And it's getting cleaner, and with states with policies like ours, it should get a lot cleaner over time. But there are states that don't have those aggressive policies, and those states may not want to pay for it, or they might not want to cite it. So there's lots of different issues related to interconnection, to getting your certificates of public convenience and necessity, But at the same time, there are solutions, and I think Eric can probably talk about this much better than I can. But New Jersey, for example, has decided it's going to go ahead with a big proposal, but they decided they're going to pay for this itself, and PJM has signed off on major transmission infrastructure to facilitate offshore wind. But they're going to have to go essentially begging to other states to help contribute to those costs. That's not where a state wants to be. It's great for New Jersey to move ahead, but it's going to be building transmission that potentially a lot of other states are going to benefit from, but there's no requirement, at least right now, for those states to contribute. Just one other example of a regional initiative is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has allowances in trading. So the states that are in that, it affects generation in those states and essentially increases the price of that generation coming out of the state if it's not clean, because and then it goes into PJM, and it does have it has an effect on competition in the PJM power market by making like Maryland generation a little more expensive than, say, generation in a state that is not in RGGI. So Ohio can sell its power in the PJM, its fossil fuel power, at a cheaper price than Maryland can. So it creates some challenges within the market, but it is, that's out there as a solution. If we don't have like some overarching federal solution, that's one thing states in a region could, that concept is there. So.
Yep. Thank you. Eric, have you seen current initiatives underway by states that you think could lead to collaborative efforts to reach their clean energy or address their climate goals?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. First to say, I think the states are the prime movers in creating whole industries like the offshore wind industry. If it wasn't for the states and their legislatures and their activities to procure offshore wind, we would have a much more difficult time actually getting contracts and building things. So the states, in my view, have been really seminal in moving a lot of the industry forward. And the same is true with onshore wind and solar, but offshore wind is a perfect example in my mind. States have tried in the past to work together, and particularly the New England states, the 6 New England states have tried to work past to procure renewable resources, and those efforts have really not resulted in much tangible development. There's a new initiative underway by 5 of the 6 New England states. Vermont, sitting on the sidelines, but the other 5 New England states have its RFI on the street right now, looking for information about how they can jointly procure transmission solutions to help deliver offshore wind to the region, which I think is a great first step. I wish them well. We're going to be there, providing technical support, providing logistics, and eventually, if they do go for procurement, we will offer in a few solutions ourselves in a competitive bidding process. So that's something I have some optimism with, because the states do have, at least Connecticut, Rhode Island, Mass, have offshore wind goals. In a big picture, we'd love to see them work on an interregional basis with New York and New Jersey and the other PJM states to create sort of a national, holistic offshore wind transmission approach that would really help get us to this 30 gigawatt federal goal of offshore wind. Transmission is really necessary and needed badly to allow us to really get those electrons onto the grid. So I think there are some examples of states working well together. I think they're at a very initial stage right now on the offshore wind side. The project that David mentioned in New Jersey, it's interesting your perspective, of sort of big dollar perspective. From our perspective, a sort of small dollar. The state ended up with a pretty small dollar, a pretty modest selection in offshore wind transmission solutions, mostly focused on some onshore upgrades, where my company and others were proposing sort of a more ambitious offshore grid, that backbone grid that would help New Jersey and other states interconnect. But the cost allocation problem is the key to all this, and how the states can share the cost, and having New Jersey ratepayers pay for this entire project when it's going to benefit a lot of the other PJM states, undoubtedly, it is something that has to change.
Yes, cost allocation is a big topic right now. For those of you who don't know, so I work for NARUC, and NARUC is part of a joint task force with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, looking at electric transmission, and cost allocation comes up a lot. So Eric just talked about mostly New England, the Northeast. Autumn, do you see other regional or geographic trends among the states working together?
Yeah. So states are very much individual, but there are some geographic trends, and I think a lot of that might be tied to having similar market structures. So you've got, the Southeast and the West that are big PURPA markets right now that are looking at PURPA reform. There's a lot of land.
PURPA?
Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act.
Yes.
Yep, for utility scale renewable energy deployment for the most part. But there's, historically no wholesale power market in these regions, so that is the main mechanism for these generators to actually participate. I think you've got a lot more distributed energy resource activity in the Northeast. A lot of the big incentive programs that are being offered for DERs are in the Northeast region. I think there are some places where there's a lot of controversy right now about things like third-party power purchase agreements, areas where you have vertically integrated utilities that own generation. So there can be kind of an incentive against that. And, obviously there are no offshore wind targets in the middle of the country. So you see primarily offshore wind policy.
Yet.
Yeah. Transmission. So you see a lot of those targets being adopted on the coast. So, there are some regional trends, but I think a lot of these are driven by the resource availability in these states, as well as the market structure that's in place, and that can often have a geographical correlation.
Great. All right, I'm just giving the audience a warning. I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm turning to you all. All right, you're on standby. So what do you see as the main impediments to success for states working together? David, Eric, do you want to? Nothing. It's all great.
I would just say
Cost allocation.
All right, that's the easy one.
That's the easy one, but it's the key. I mean, that's what has thrown monkey wrench into previous efforts of states really trying to work together, and until it can be ironed out, I think it's a major challenge.
I would add that siting is a big issue as well. We're involved in a case in Pennsylvania for a transmission project that Maryland has approved, and it's been in the works for years. Money has been spent. Money is being recovered from ratepayers, but it's not clear whether the project is ever going to be completed because it's in the Pennsylvania courts. Pennsylvania's been challenging it. And it might be going up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it's just a siting issue. So siting is also a big problem. Transmission almost by its very nature is interstate, and so you can't have one state making a decision without the cooperation of other states, and it's just not always there.
I'd throw in one more too.
Sure.
That I think is just not talked about a lot, and it's the differences in the statutory authority that's given to utility commissions. Some of them have been authorized or required to look at things like environmental considerations, equity considerations, economic development, but others are specifically required to approve, least cost solutions, and they do not have the authority to look outside of that. So that can be an impediment, I think, to some states working together.
Yes, I agree. I've heard a lot about that. Okay, audience. All right, I think there's a mic coming your way.
It's a cost allocation question. I'm sorry, can't help myself. So I mostly practice in MISO, and we've had some really good success with cost allocation for transmission. I'd argue it's the reason why the MVP portfolio of like 18 projects were built. And I'm just wondering, I'd never heard or thought about cost allocation for like an actual plant among states. Are you all familiar with anyone ever doing that before? You know, cost allocation. Again, I assume like a big offshore wind farm, you're talking about allocating the cost of the project to multiple states who are going to benefit from the energy. That's I think would work, but I'm not familiar with whether that's been done before.
No, not for a particular like offshore wind plant. They've all been state specific. I think you run into really difficult problems with how much of the cost should be allocated to each state if you would try that. But the states have, like the New England states wanted to do, back almost 20 years ago, wanted to do, I think, procure like 1,400 megawatts of clean power. They ended up, the 3 northern New England states ended up saying, screw you, we don't want to participate in that. The 3 southern states bought like 400 megawatts of solar in New York. And so it was very underwhelming. They are currently now considering this transmission where the states would procure a transmission system and then somehow divide up the cost of that. I don't know how that, I don't think anyone's really laid that out specifically yet, but that's certainly the concept that the New England states now are, minus Vermont, are considering.
I would say that what's an important consideration in thinking about that is the market structure that Autumn referred to, because if you have a vertically integrated utility and maybe that vertically integrated utility, most of them are owned by a much larger parent company, and they may own, a utility may expand more than one state, or the holding company might have utilities in multiple states. And so it might be more likely in that situation in a state like Maryland that has, you know, where generation is treated separately and generation goes through, you know, everyone gets it through PJM. The state can impose requirements on retail sellers, including the utilities provision of the default service, you know, to procure a certain type of power, but there's never a requirement to procure it from a particular plant. Like even, you know, Calvert Cliffs is something like 40% of, that number might not be quite right, of Maryland's in-state generation nuclear plant. But we don't, when you know, Maryland consumers get a lot of that power, obviously, but whether we're buying it or not is sort of, who knows? I mean, we're buying it through PJM as part of, out of the PJM market. So it's just, I think it's a different situation in a, depending on the market structure.
Thank you. Sorry, another question?
Thank you. My question is about offshore wind. Autumn, you particularly mentioned the middle states, and I was thinking about the Great Lakes states and offshore wind generation there. And I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the environment and what that looks like, especially with transmission through the Great Lakes states.
Well, I know I haven't really seen a lot of policy activity on offshore wind in the Great Lakes state. It's all been on the coast, but I'm sure you can speak more to that if you've seen anything.
Yeah, I think Ohio is pursuing one project, Lake Erie. There are potentially more negative environmental impacts, specifically with bird flyways over the Great Lakes. So my company has not been all that interested in those. And there are some discussions, but I think because of the mitigation you would need to protect birds, it's probably marginally economically viable.
Thank you.
Other audience? Oh, another audience question.
Thanks. This question is for David. You spoke about the statute that expanded your mandate to consider clean energy goals and DR deployment in your mission. I'm wondering how you kind of practically square that in your office when you're talking about DR deployment and how it might increase rates for ratepayers or costs for them. So where's the balance there in your office? And I guess in speaking to the panel, how would you advise other state people's councils or other state advocacy groups for consumers that might be trying to square that diametric opposition?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's a challenge we're sort of addressing all the time. I would say that I think it's the majority, maybe even the vast majority of situations, it doesn't come up because what we think is best for consumers is also the best course for the environment. There's a lot of overlap now. And I mean, just take, home heating, we have electric heat pumps now, and, looking at the longer term, there's no question that consumers are better off with, we need policies to support low, people who can't afford the upfront costs and that sort of thing. But as far as thinking about where we're going long term, there's no real debate there between natural gas, at least from the work that we've done. But there are situations where there's some tension, and really we work hard to come up with solutions. And I think I see our mandate as following the policy goals of the General Assembly. So our General Assembly has said net zero by 2045, 60% from 2008 levels by 2031, which is pretty aggressive. And so what we're going to do is we're trying to identify the lowest cost path to actually achieve that goal. And that's a state goal. And so we're not going to push up, against that goal, say, oh, it's too expensive or it's unachievable. We're going to advocate for the lowest cost means to accomplish that. I mean, one of the more interesting areas that we have not, fully, or we're looking at, but we haven't fully engaged in, is the debate that's going on in North Carolina and California and other states on net metering and on the credit that customers get. That is, that's a very challenging issue because if the credit isn't right, you can end up, raising the rates of customers who might not be able to net meter. So that there, but like everything involving utility regulation, it's nuanced and complicated, and it takes really looking at the facts and trying to, to get it right. And in some situations, maybe, we are aligned with many of the environmental groups in our state, but we are perfectly willing to say, no, that's not the best way to go forward. So, I'm not sure that we're aligned on everything, but, for the most part, it hasn't been a big issue. And really, I think on some of the really most important issues, the biggest issue in Maryland is all the spending that the gas distribution utilities are spending on their infrastructure. These are investments that are locked in. They're being made today. Baltimore Gas and Electric, our largest gas utility, is spending $1.2 million every single day on new capital infrastructure. And that's recovered through depreciation over decades and decades to come. Customers actually spend about 3 times that amount once you add in the return on the investment that the utilities get. And that, to me is the big, if we can't support two infrastructures at the same time when we don't need the one, and the gas utilities themselves know that all this money they're spending on new pipes or replacing pipes, they don't know what it's going to be used for. But they also know that under utility regulatory law, once they spend that money, they have a strong legal claim to recover it, regardless of whether it's useful or not in the future. And they have some political clout in the state. And so that's where the customers are really going to get slammed, or the state through its taxpayers when those assets become stranded. So, that's the big picture, issue. We can, there's lots of smaller picture issues, but the big picture issues, I think, consumer and environmental interests are largely aligned.
Thank you. Kevin?
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Jones, and I direct the Institute for Energy and the Environment at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Know many of you. And I will start out by reading a question that came from our live streamers out there, and there's a lot of them. So this is directed to Eric, and asks whether you can talk about your top 5 large firm partnerships and more on Maersk, and whether that slows you down or is that a benefit? And then I'm going to have a question for myself after that.
Top 5 partnerships. We our mature projects in Europe and in Asia have both offtake agreements with the utilities, as well as corporate power purchase agreements or PPAs. And we're always looking for more opportunities to do PPAs. We've got very large PPAs existing with companies that you might have heard of, like Amazon, and a number of the other big players buy a lot of our power. So those are kind of the corporate partnerships that we really like. Another part of our business model is we call it farm down. So we'll get the contract for an offshore wind farm, we'll build it, we start to operate it, and then we'll sell 50% of it to another party who wants income potential. We'll maintain the other 50% ownership, and we'll own and operate that plant. So we're always looking for partners to do that as well. The Maersk partnership, I think, is the tip of the iceberg, because especially in Europe, the governments understand that decarbonizing the transportation sector, especially the hard parts like shipping and airline industry, is going to be a tremendous challenge. You can't really do those things with batteries, lithium batteries or other kind of batteries. So looking for green fuels that will power those transportation sectors is big. There's a lot of hydrogen production that is beginning now in Europe, and that hydrogen can be used in a lot of different ways in the transportation sector, but also we can make green methane and green natural gas that can be distributed through the natural gas system. So there are a lot of options that are just sort of forming now on the table, and we are going to pursue those very vigorously going. It's definitely a significant part of our long-term business plans.
And this is probably a good time to remind our live streamers, if you do have questions, you type them in the chat and Brock will get them out to us. And I have a question for all of you, and it's has some Maryland roots in it, David, in that it really came out of some work that we did for the Maryland Climate Coalition. And I'm looking across from seeing Justin Somleski from the Sierra Club, who was a student then and worked on that project, and Tamara also, who was one of the stakeholders then, is going to be our keynote speaker later. But at that time, in as you said, Maryland's been a leader in terms of renewable energy policy. And so one of the things that was kind of a troubling question then is, when states like Maryland step up and put out goals like being 100% renewable by a point in time, how do they do that and make sure that the people of that state are most benefiting in a way from that policy goal, or maybe a neighboring state has a better renewable energy resource. It might be onshore wind, or it just might be because of some of the early infrastructure that Massachusetts or New York are better to build the early offshore wind projects. But how do we get the states to kind of cooperate and work together on those goals, but not be so concerned to want to put up silos and say only do it, and we have to somehow limit doing it in our state, where maybe the most cost-effective way to move us toward those climate goals is to build it where it's cheapest at this point in time. How do we deal with that challenge?
I'll take a first stab.
Great.
I think David alluded to this earlier, and I'll use harsher language than he does, but it is kind of a fallacy that the states think that they can produce green energy for their customers, when everywhere except for Texas, really, power goes into the grid. No one knows really where the electrons come from. So that being said, it's very difficult to sort of count precisely how much state A is producing versus state B, and come up with an exact percentage of what consumers are getting pursuant to state policy. That's just the nature of the physics of the electric grid and how it's structured and how the interstate portion of it really operates. That being said, if state A and state B both adopt measures to clean the grid is going to get cleaner and cleaner. And so their constituents will have cleaner power eventually.
Yeah, and my reaction was actually very much the same. I'm thinking, well, electrons don't know state borders, and so all we can do as the state of Maryland is we can have a requirement that we don't have a 100% RPS right now, but we have 50%. But the legislature, I think they understand that in order to meet the carbon reduction goals, it really has to go up to 100% or close to it. But that does not mean that, Maryland will still be dependent on whatever mix is in PJM. We can take financial responsibility so that either, what is produced in Maryland is renewable. That can be done, through the certificates, renewable energy certificates. Those, some people are questioning the accuracy of those. I think generally they're probably, there is something to them. So that it can be done that way, and it can be done by requiring in-state generation to be clean. So we can take responsibility for what is generated within the state of Maryland borders, but Maryland is a net importer. So we're going to take generation from other states, but it all goes through PJM. So for the generation for other states, it can be through like PPA, power purchase agreements, specifically for renewables, or it can be done through like a renewable requirement and the purchasing of renewable credits that are actually tied to real output from generation. I do think that there's I think this whole idea is still evolving, because even like the certificate market it's not always precise, right? Because there's different demands at different hours of the day. And so you can buy certificates, but maybe you're buying certificates for solar, and that's only, that's coming in during the hours when the sun is providing that solar. But really your demand is more, at peak in the evening time when the solar isn't, so there's, and I think over time we're going to see there's some efforts now out there to start tracking more closely, aligning the output with the demand. And so you get closer to being truly dependent only on clean energy, but I think we've got a ways to go with that.
And I would say something similar to what David just said. A very discrete thing would be to make your renewable energy certificates not have to be from in-state resources only. I think usually when there's an ISO or an RTO, ones from that region are able to satisfy the requirement. So one thing you could do is, getting back to utility business model reform and encouraging more states to be a part of these wholesale markets, so that you have access to a greater, array of resources, more land for these resources. And then I do think there can be a challenge when states that are located next to each other do not have the same policy goals. So for example, in North Carolina, there's a carbon neutral by 2050 goal. South Carolina does not have any goal, but Duke Energy operates in both North Carolina and South Carolina, and their balancing authority goes over both states. So there's a big question right now as to whether the South Carolina Public Service Commission is going to approve Duke's integrated resource plan that includes all of the clean energy resources that they need to meet the carbon neutral goal in North Carolina. So when you don't have policy alignment, it can create some issues there.
And if I can ask just a quick follow-up question, there's another aspect of this, and this is the jobs, not where the electrons flow, but the jobs. And so, if maybe it's cheaper right now to build offshore wind off Boston, but if I happen to, be a policymaker that's concerned about jobs in Baltimore, how do we get states to cooperate on that? And eventually we'll build out offshore wind across the whole eastern seaboard, but if we don't hit some scale and bring costs down, so any thoughts on the jobs piece?
Eric and I can't remember if it's Ørsted or U.S. or your competitor, U.S. Wind, but as part of Maryland's offshore wind procurement that was, part of legislation and was approved last fall with the Public Service Commission. One of the wind companies, I'm not sure if it's your company or not, or the other one, but has committed to at Sparrows Point in Baltimore. A manufacturing facility to produce the wind turbines and to create jobs. So, states can, and that was part of the legislation, and the consideration was the jobs component of it. Not sure if that answers your question or not, but.
Yeah, I would just add that for our offshore wind projects, because we're essentially starting a whole new industry in the United States, we're touching 40 states. There are engines being made for ships in Detroit. There are ships being made in Texas and Louisiana, parts from all over. So cables from South Carolina. We are putting people to work in states you wouldn't normally think are associated with offshore wind, just because we have to build ships and we have to build so much infrastructure to deal with it. So we are, it's pretty amazing the far reach that we've had, and really we haven't put any steel in the water yet.
And one thing that we've also seen too across the country for RFPs for clean energy resources, we're seeing more of these include bid preferences for local labor and apprenticeships. So things like that can help to encourage jobs in that particular area too.
We're also committed to using in labor.
All right, well, thank you. So we're nearing the end of our time together, so sad. But I'm gonna give each of the panelists a minute to just say their final closing thoughts on the topic. However, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't sort of throw out there the idea of talking about the election that's only a few days away. Politico sent out an email last night that said climate action is on the ballot. And so they were mostly talking about at the federal level for the House and the Senate, but these are also important issues at the level of governors and such. So my question to you is, are you generally optimistic about the future of state action on climate goals? And if you wanted to mention something about the election, please do.
Well, I'll go first, I suppose. I would say I'm very optimistic about the future, especially at the state level. Even though federal policy seems to get a lot more attention, there's just so much happening at the state level. That's really where clean energy policy is. It's been for a long time, and where markets are kind of made or broken. So I think it's important for states to just continue learning from each other, trying different approaches. Not every state may adopt a 100% clean energy target, but there's some things that can be done that are also, I think, palatable across the political spectrum that do move the needle. So things like, great design and integrated resource plan reform, utility business models, things like that, that can be done and actually do make a concrete difference on the ground. So I would say that I'm optimistic, overall.
Thank you.
I try and keep optimistic. And there is reason to be optimistic. I mean, Maryland has enacted some great policies and statute. I think it's easy to rest on lofty goals, and it's all in the details of how it gets implemented. And the reality is that I think, we have to continue, I say we in the big context of we continue to make sure that policies actually are followed through, that there's implementation to actually accomplish these goals. And the reality is that there is a lot of money involved, and there are a lot of entrenched interests that do not want to see substantial change or are going to push back. We have fossil fuel industry in this country that is really pushing back against the clean energy transition, and to get something in legislation is itself a big lift. But then what gets lost, I think, in the undercurrent is the capacity of the resources that are behind undermining that at the implementation level. And so we need to be very aware of that. In the utility sector, it's hard enough to get something, a legislation enacted, but then there's a whole nother fight at the Public Service Commission level, and not a lot of people understand what happens in the public service commissions, and it really takes an effort, I think, and it's something that I'm really trying to do is educate policymakers, advocates, people in Maryland to understand how utility rates are set and what that means for different utilities, and what that means for what we're hearing about, how expensive it's going to be to build the infrastructure, transmission, and there are costs. There's a lot of money. That's the whole point. But we need to understand the incentives under which the industry operates, the fossil fuel industry, the electric utilities, because we need to follow through on those changes there. And part of that is making sure, that we do elect people who are looking at facts and are trying to understand things, and that are thinkers, and they understand that that you can't make policy based on a Twitter message. It takes more than that. Things are more complicated and more nuanced, and it takes an effort to understand. And we want to elect people who are willing to make that effort. And hopefully we will.
I would just say I'm optimistic because it's part of my DNA, but also, I've talked a lot about blue states today, in England and New York and sort of the East Coast, but look at Texas. They've got over 20, I don't know what the number is, but they've got over 20 gigawatts of wind installed. That's a tremendous amount of power. We just built a solar facility in Texas. It has, I think it's about a 400 megawatt plant. It's got over 1 million panels. It's huge. Mississippi, we just built a 300 megawatt solar farm in Mississippi. Why? Because it's cheap. It's the cheapest form of power. So ground mounted solar, by far the cheapest amount of power. So red states don't necessarily talk the climate talk, but they see where the dollars and cents are, and they want cheap power. So there's reason to be optimistic, I think, from that sense. And on the offshore wind side, yes, we're a high capital cost resource, but we have zero fuel costs, and we have very low operating costs over the length of a 20-year contract. It's beneficial for consumers. The Massachusetts DPU, their analysis of the Vineyard Wind up, one of our competitors' projects, said that the consumers of Massachusetts will save over $1 billion over that 20-year life of that contract. So it makes economic sense, even if taking carbon out of the picture altogether. The states are going to see that more and more, and I'm optimistic about the future. And vote early and often.
Yes. Well, maybe not often, or don't tell anybody if it's often. Well, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for a great discussion today. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will now turn it over to Brian.
Thank you. I'll just say I'd like to plug Desire. I found it, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it is a great place if you're doing a presentation and need a chart or need updated data on what's happening around the country. It really is an amazing resource. So we're going to move on to our second panel as Marnie changes the nameplate up here. The second panel is what innovations are corporate actors making now, and we have a great panel. I'm going to hand it off to Cristina, whose last name I'm going to mess up, Banahan. Yes. And she's from TransUnion.
Yes.
And I'll let you introduce the panelists.
Yes, they're just, yeah. Oh, great. Well, hello. Thank you for having us. It's very exciting to be here. I'd like to give a warm welcome to all our colleagues, attorneys, advocates, those that have yet to decide, to our corporate panel. As my colleague mentioned, my name is Chris Banahan. I have a background in public policy, having started my career in Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, but today I work as head of sustainability and corporate citizenship at TransUnion. It's a very exciting time. I will introduce my rock star panel in just a moment, but before I do that, I'd love to give a little bit of background and grounding for my colleagues that may be less familiar with what amazing work corporations are doing right now in sustainability and climate action. So corporations come to climate from a long heritage of sustainability. So the discussion started in the 60s and 70s around really what is the role of a corporation and how does that pertain to their license to operate. In the 70s, as you all well know, some of the most important environmental legislation for this country was passed, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And since then, corporate action on sustainability issues has only increased. So we've seen it first slowly, but focused around transparency and reporting, a lot of emphasis in efficiency, environmental efficiency, energy efficiency. But all of that changed in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. A number of corporations came out with climate commitments as a result of that, and countries making their own commitments around this topic. Today, over 3,000 companies have climate commitments that are focused around the 1.5 degrees Celsius agreement. But the true leaders are those that are looking at climate change like an opportunity. They're looking at climate change as an opportunity to produce products that we need today to transition to a clean economy, but also products that we will be using in the future. climate change is front and center for companies because it will impact the bottom line of companies. It offers the opportunity to create products that can edge out their competitors. And also, companies are thinking of climate change as it pertains to risk. So whether the companies will be prepared as regulators increasingly focus on climate change, whether companies will be impacted from their investments in assets and also their physical locations, how their people are potentially impacted from climate change, natural disasters, all this factors into why companies deeply care about climate change and addressing that. So today we will hear from our amazing panel. Evan, who is directly on my left, joins us. He is managing counsel and public policy strategist at Ford Motors. Evan leads legal and policy matters concerning fuel economy standards, zero emission vehicles, vehicle goals, energy storage, battery recycling, among many other environmental and social governance efforts. Before his role at Ford, Evan was a U.S. leader in efforts to enforce air pollution standards as acting director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We also have Kendra Brown, who is vice president of policy for MasterCard, and she is also the chair of Maryland State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. She previously served as chief of staff to Congressman G.K. Butterfield from North Carolina, and the senior director of diversity, inclusion, and affinity for the Washington College of Law at American University. And last but not least, we have Jesse Sevcik. Jesse is responsible for global public policy and government affairs for Elanco. For those of you that may not know Elanco, it is a pharmaceutical company that develops, manufactures, and markets animal health and veterinary products in more than 90 countries. And prior to Elanco, Jesse held a variety of roles in the U.S. House of Representatives, farmer cooperatives, and other agricultural entities. So welcome to my amazing panel.
Great
Thank
to be
you.
here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So all of our panelists have prepared some introductory remarks to help familiarize all of us with the work that their respective companies are doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Evan, and he's going to kick us off.
Sure. Very glad to be here, Vermont Law 2010. And I'll just say for a little bit of background, I came right to DC and was at the US EPA for 11 years and then have been at Ford Motor Company for just about 11 months. And so I'm there long enough to have more work than I know what to do with, but I'm still pretty new in a very large company. Where to start? I think it's just an absolutely fascinating time to be in lots of industries, and that's definitely true when it comes to cars and trucks. Transportation is the US's largest single source of GHG emissions. It continues to be a source of pollution that harms people's health, that is predominantly in areas that are otherwise underserved, near roadways, and are marginalized. And so, air quality drove me for 11 years at EPA, and it drives me still here at Ford. I was skeptical, having investigated and beaten up on automakers for a long time when I came into Ford, but the honest truth is what's happening is it's both feet in on electrification, and the entire game is how to get down and get over the barriers that are in the way to doing it faster. And those barriers are many, and most of them have some public policy and legal dimension to it. And so part of what I do is to help advise the company on any number of things, including purchasing, obviously things that are directly about environmental regulation, like emission standards. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and our role with California, how that works. And and to try to chart a course to zero emissions, a course that allows us to remain competitive, that allows us to serve a lot of our other goals. And the game is really about aligning the business case with the climate goals. And so we also have science-based targets keeping us on track to do our part to reach the Paris climate goals as well. And so, again, predominantly classic environmental stuff, but we're doing a lot on energy, doing a lot on now tax policy, as it turns out, and trade issues. All of those things are really, really important when you're ultimately looking to serve the goal of decarbonization. So that's about a little bit of what I do at Ford. Kendra?
Awesome. So we have a lot of overlap, and MasterCard, our motto is to do well by doing good. And that means that we need to show up in a way that benefits our globe also. So I'm very grateful to be at MasterCard. I've been at the company since March of 2020. There are a few things that changed that year, slightly, but I had no idea what was coming. So I started at MasterCard on March the 3rd. It was only in the office for a week and a half when the world shut down. And so definitely was very, it was a tough time to feel as if I left my friends and colleagues on Capitol Hill, to kind of fend for what was happening in the world. But then there were so many different ways that as a company, I was able to be at the table and so many things happening across not only our nation, but across the globe. And so at MasterCard, as Vice President of Public Policy for Federal Affairs, I handle all of our work that has to do with the federal government, but that also includes, tax. He said tax is one of my favorite topics, right? So tax, trade, social justice, equity, climate, and how all of that intersects in the work that we do. So we've made several commitments that even, of course, predate me being at the company, but we also have, a net zero timeline that, we have pledged towards and committed to as a part of our ESG goals. We have so much that we are doing. We are part of the Priceless Planet initiative where we have pledged to continue planting 1 million trees, across our globe. So just so many different ways that we are a part of building what is best for our globe, and many different ways that I can share that. But there are things that are happening across the globe, even as we speak, that really bring us to the table as to how we can be the best corporate citizen that we're supposed to be.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse Sevcik. I'm with Elanco Animal Health. Elanco is an animal health company. As Chris said, we produce medicines for animals. Some of you might be scratching your head and saying, what is a pharmaceutical company, doing on a panel like this, especially related to energy? And so I think the framing for that, the way to think about it, is that the United States produces roughly about 6 billion tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions, thereabouts. About 10% of that comes from agriculture. So and a big part of that 10% that comes from agriculture comes from cattle, livestock. And my company produces medicines and a wide range of products and feed additives for livestock. We see a fundamental part of our future in our ability to help farmers, partner with them to be able to address some of that. A cow or beef animal, a dairy cow or beef animal, will produce about 1 ton a year of greenhouse gas equivalent, CO2 equivalent. So if we're in a kind of partner in this climate change effort and really get to focus on it, there's an opportunity to address that. I think we have about 8 years left between now and some of the 2030 goals, whether it's for greenhouse gases or methane, different pledges that are out there. But also during those 8 years, we anticipate that the globe will demand another 90 million metric ton of animal protein. And that is generally a good thing because most of that is coming from low and middle income countries as they rise up from lower incomes. One of the first things they do is improve their diet. And we anticipate, right, even after 2030, that about 11 to 12 million metric ton increase will keep on happening. So how do we do that in a sustainable way? How do we address, that add demand for protein and a better diet with also the challenges of climate? We think we offer some unique solutions in this space. There have been farmers have adapted their diets of their livestock for a number of years in the U.S. and have reduced phosphorus and nitrogen and other key elements through adjustments to husbandry, and we think there's some real powerful opportunities in the very near future to be able to do this. There's also an opportunity for the United States to lead in this space, in that we are been a net exporter of agriculture for many years. This is one of our strong stories in the trade space, where we really export a lot. The American farmer is very productive, and so there's that real opportunity for us to do that. But we do think there is some policy changes that do need to be tweaked or enabled at the federal and possibly even state level that could help accelerate some of this gain for our ability to do this and advance it in an appropriate way. We do recognize that food is also very personal. Our corporate vision is food and companionship to enrich life. And the idea is that we need to think about how do we do this in a way that enables choice, that enables sustainability in a very holistic sense. So looking forward to this afternoon's conversation, and maybe that's just a little bit about who we are.
I think that is a perfect segue to my first question. Jesse, thank you for setting me up. And so what are some of the legal, legislative, regulatory barriers that you see to companies acting on climate?
Should I start?
Sure.
Yep. So from a car maker's perspective, at the federal level, at least let's just focus on the US, it's difficult when the standards are flipping and flopping back and forth. It's very difficult to align that with business planning. Like a lot of industries, car companies need to plan years out. You know, right now we're planning our model year 26, 27 products, and we need to not only design them, but decide where we're going to get materials for them and otherwise chart a course that's profitable and compliant. And so when the curve you're on to reduce greenhouse gas emissions keeps going all over the place, it's been really difficult. And so one of the main reasons of even that forward is because in the last administration, when that was happening, there was a strong deregulatory effort. I'm looking at Matt. Who could help me remember those days? At EPA, there was Ford. I wasn't there, but Ford decided, you know what, we're going to side with California, who has unique authority under the Clean Air Act to establish its own standards, provided they're the same or stricter as the federal standards. And that was a strategy to overcome an obstacle and make sure that we could decide, by and large, have our own agency to decide what it is we're going to make and be sure that it's going to comply and have some insurance against, some of that flipping and flopping. And so that's actually animated. That's been really successful for the company. It's done really well in terms of just finding efficiencies, in terms of not needing to go back and reorient ourselves to whatever cycle plan needs to be revisited in light of the new standards. And it's set us up really well for what's happening now, which is that we're leading the electric revolution. We're the number 2 seller of electric vehicles in the United States, behind Tesla for now, not for long. And we intend to absolutely compete and outcompete everybody on that. And so standards themselves, they matter. They matter a lot. And so that alone is one of the major barriers to making sure that those actually work. Right now, the standards are happening. They're being developed both for at the federal level and at the California level for light duty and for heavy duty vehicles. And we're at a place where it's actually a very interesting obstacle, which is that there's a lot of inertia. Understandably, since the beginning of the Clean Air Act, it's been about getting emissions lower. And it's been about ensuring that automakers are getting tighter and tighter emission controls in the engine and the after treatment systems. But at this point, our math shows that if we just left the way we currently make gasoline and diesel engines, we don't have to mess with that design, and we can continue making that for the next 15 years till we're done with internal combustion engine in this market, that we would actually achieve better GHG reductions and criteria emission reductions if we just use that money instead to invest in electrification, whatever needs to happen, sourcing and other kinds of retooling, domestic production. And so that's a barrier, because that's a lot of inertia, and it's really hard as from a regulator's perspective to necessarily right away agree with the company who has always been an industry, who has since the beginning said that's too far, you're going too far, we can't reach that. And now we're trying to say, well, we could reach that, but there's a cost, and help us put that investment cost to the best possible use. So that's on the environmental side. On the energy side, given the audience, I wanted to point out that an obstacle that we're seeing is there's a lot of myth out there, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about how it is electric vehicles are going to be part of our ecosystem, our energy ecosystem. And so a lot of energy law is merging with environmental law and policy, and it's becoming one basic conversation because Ford vehicles, at least the EVs, are bidirectional. So they are a distributed energy resource. They move, and when they're online is basic, the choice of whoever's driving that vehicle around. But they provide tremendous amount of potential storage, and as more and more of the population of vehicles out there become electrified, and they're mostly plugged in, they could be a tremendous resource. But at the same time, the obstacle is that we see a lot of people who are saying, yeah, but we don't have the grid ready for that. And there's plenty of deficiencies in the grid without electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are going to need a lot of electricity, but there's a lot of opportunity to do it in a really sophisticated way that allows for whatever investments that need to happen to go into the grid to happen at their regular pace, and for there to be no barriers for people to be able to go electric if they want to. And that includes getting the charging that they need. And so, for example, if Ford knows that there are 6 electric vehicles on one little cul-de-sac and somewhere where the grid is a little bit flimsy, we can manage and charge. Those vehicles can talk to each other and share whatever is available. And that can help make sure that everybody has as much charge as they can get by the morning, and nobody's overloading the local transformer, the local infrastructure. We're doing a pilot with Duke Energy that's going to start next year, whereby people who buy our electric pickup truck and integrate it to their home so they can back up their home and even feed the grid will get a break on their lease payment from us, and then we get a direct payment from Duke, the utility, and then Duke is going to study how it is these 100 or so truck drivers act. How often are they plugged in? What's their willingness to make their vehicle available to supplement the grid during peak hours? Maybe Duke saves money not having to fire a peaker plant somewhere because they can just take entire neighborhoods and power them from electric trucks. So that's not regulatory at all. That's just largely led by technical minds, but there's a policy element to it because we need to. And for Ford, I'm talking to the utilities about how that all works.
I imagine that there's also an impact at the flip-flopping on the financial services industry. So Kendra, can you give us a perspective from MasterCard?
Sure, I would say, even from my prior role, kind of bringing that in here, when you have just a general principle, when you have patchwork, regulations or standards, it's challenging, right? And it makes for a challenging landscape. And working for a company such as MasterCard that is global, we are in constant communication, not only with our teammates here in the United States, but constantly talking to folks across the world on what's happening. I'm speaking with leaders of countries just all over the world on what is happening in that particular nation, how it has a bearing, what the global standards are, and how that has a bearing on what they are doing and what we are doing. So as a company, our lens is tailored based on the region, right? And so for us within the financial services sector, we communicate often in ways that we're able to with other companies that are similarly situated to ensure that we, are doing our part and are consistent. But I think that the benefit of working for, a company that is so interconnected globally is that we're able to kind of peel back the lens in any specific, area as far as what is happening there. But I would say that for me and the work that we do, having a patchwork, of regs can be challenging, but it is our role, right? It is our role to monitor. And so not only monitoring what's happening at the federal level, but we also have a state team. So we know what's happening in states, what's happening in territories. So that's what I would share relative to what's coming.
Yeah, Jesse.
In the animal space, we experience some barriers as well, and probably put these into maybe 3 categories. And so we want to reduce the impact of on the environment, especially on methane or on carbon. The key thing is for farmers to be able to have access to those tools And so in other countries, oftentimes these tools will be regulated as feed additives, and they will go through a review for safety and then be made available. In the US, they generally treat these as drugs. And so that means then our cost of investment to bring a drug to the market is much higher than that of a feed additive. And the timeline necessary is much longer as well. A drug will take about 10 years to get to market, as well as probably several million more dollars of investment to go into that to recover versus a feed additive. Safety is the same. It's just more on the efficacy side is what a way to think about it. And so there are feed additives available in Europe and Australia and elsewhere in the globe that can reduce methane in cattle by about 30 to 50%, which is huge, right? Methane is about 28 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon is, or CO2, excuse me. And so it's a real opportunity there to view this a little bit differently. And so we are actively standing at FDA's doorstep saying, you have the authority. Maybe you should consider how to interpret this rule in the space. And oftentimes, it comes down to intent and what is the intent of use of something. And in this case, right, this is a feed additive that reduces methane. We have other feed additives that reduce phosphorus, right, which is very important from a groundwater perspective. And those are still made available to farmers because they are made available through the nutrition claim or something that they have. So we try and find a way to encourage FDA to evolve its understanding so these products can come to the market and make those tools available. The second area I would say that we have some challenge on, and this kind of builds on Evan's space, but a little bit different, is that relative to standards in our space and being able to measure. Farmers are willing to take action to reduce methane, to reduce carbon, and right now the measurement tools that are out there are kind of limited, and it's a little bit of the Wild West, if you will. And we look across the Atlantic, we see some of the issues that they've had, right? They've had a number of cases, like there's even 2 series on Netflix right now about carbon fraud, about Europe. And what we want to do is that we've had, right, our cases in the US as well, where some exchanges haven't done as well. And so the idea is, like, how do we develop some integrity? How do we develop the tools and measurement systems necessary so that there's confidence that if you're buying those carbon credits, you're actually getting the true offset of what that is. And if you are selling, you're truly selling something that represents a carbon offset and is disclosed. This is an opportunity, I think, especially in the coming year. The Farm Bill is going to be up for reauthorization in 2023. And then it's a real opportunity to speak to some of those issues about measurement and making sure that there's accurate measurement tools available in this space. The third area, and probably one of the more pernicious or difficult ones, is what about the value that this is, right? Some of the feed additives we sell give a derived benefit. That is, you can reduce methane and you'll get a productivity benefit. You'll have a greater conversion of your feed into milk or into meat or eggs. But some of these only will reduce methane or only will reduce carbon. And so what is the economic value associated with that, and how do we incentivize investment in things that only give an environmental benefit? If you looked at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange today, carbon is trading at like $3.34, which is really low for a farmer to be able to say, I'm not going to, $3, I'm not going to make that trade. It's pretty straightforward. And so we need to think about, how do we incentivize action? How do we create the right incentive structure necessary, or trading structure, if you will, that there is a value in the marketplace. So that way you have a real measured carbon credit that you can sell, and that there is a carbon market or a value out there that can help offset that investment that you made to reduce methane or carbon or a similar type of greenhouse gas. So I think those are probably 3 areas that there's some opportunity on in the very near future, both regulatory-wise as well as at the federal policy space.
So next, I'd like to pick up on a thread that came up in the previous panel around the midterm elections. And how do you anticipate the results of the midterm elections potentially impacting your respective companies' efforts? Maybe we'll start with you, Jesse, and work our way back.
Sure thing. So I mentioned in my previous response, the Farm Bill is up next year, and the Farm Bill generally starts in the House. Farm Bill is about 75% is nutrition programs. And there are 3 important things when it comes to writing a Farm Bill. Number one is the political makeup, and we'll touch on that in a second. Number two is the state of the farm economy. Right now, it's very good. And number three is how much money is available for the farm programs. And so if you look at right now, I'll work backwards, there's a good amount of money available, but we are, right, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. The idea is to slow the economy, and that will increase unemployment. Right now, we are at a fairly low, I wouldn't say historic low, but we're at a very low level of nutrition program utilization. When unemployment will go up, I would fully expect that nutrition utilization programs will go up. And so that will create a lot of pressure on the budget to say, well, you can't, all the money that you put into the IRA to go for climate adjustment that modified the Farm Bill, that money now needs to go to pay for supplemental nutrition. And so it creates a very difficult, right? And I tell you what, we'll lose that one 9 times out of 10, right? It's you don't pay nutrition in this sense, and so a lot of the adjustment as the economy slows, that money will go available into nutrition. And so any money that could go from the Farm Bill to incentivize like a green payment or methane offset, it's going to be harder to justify going in this space. The second part then, as I mentioned, is the politics. And so I would say a very good probability, right? I'm not a pollster, but it's a very good possibility that the House flips. And so if it does flip, the respective chair of the House Ag Committee feels very differently about carbon incentives. He said, under no circumstances should you buy carbon credits, is the direction that has been provided to, that he's made a statement on that. And he still wants the tools out there, so he's supportive of the tools, but he's still very skeptical about the idea of the offsets. So I think from us, we really look at this about the incentives that farmers are going to be able to have to make investments in methane offsets, especially in terms of feed additives, which are very powerful.
Yeah. I will just chime in by saying that, as someone, I don't know that there are others who have worked on the Hill, when you have a potential shift, the priorities from the Hill out change, right? And that impacts us all. It impacts us all. And so I think that staying ahead, ensuring that we are all staying ahead of what a shift means, as a company, we're monitoring that very actively. And I think that we are all just waiting to see what is going to happen, but at the same time, in ensuring that our business priorities, they don't change, right? It's just knowing how our business priorities are received on the Hill, right? And knowing how to ensure that you are educating who has to be educated, right? And knowing that folks really understand what your priorities are too. So I think that doing that well and staying ahead of things is our duty as a company, employee, right? And someone who works for an entity. So I just wanted to answer generally, right? But I think that when you do have a high potential for the flip of the House and even possibly the Senate, not quite as high, but still there, you still have to know what the priorities are of those who are in power.
Yeah, what she said. Yeah, if the House flips, from Ford's perspective, we're probably not going to see any of our legislative wish lists come true, but we are going to continue the effort we're doing now, which is really focused on the perception of electric vehicles from lawmakers in particular, but candidly from Republicans in general. There's a lot of politicization of it, and we're trying to focus on the product itself. You don't have to have climate goals or any particular ethic to like the vehicle for any number of reasons. And the business opportunity, a lot of the domestic manufacturing that we're going to grow is going to be all over the country, and it's not going to be specific to red states. So, that kind of long-term engagement and education is going to be a lot of our focus on the Hill.
Excellent. Well, we've been talking a lot about the challenges that exist and that companies are facing, but what inspires you in your industry, in your company, in the broader sustainability space that makes you optimistic? And so I think a lot of folks in the audience will have probably read the UN Environmental Programme's report that says that we are not probably going to achieve the 1.5 Celsius target that we all agreed to. So in light of dark news, how can you help us keep some hope from the corporate perspective?
I'll
Sure.
start. I mean, so, there's the famous story about the band that played on the Titanic as it sank, right? So I bring that up to point out two things. One is that I think that, you need to bring an ethic. I need to bring an ethic to my work that says, even if I'm not making progress this week, that day, that month, or even if we're slipping from long-term goals, it still matters that you show up and do your best work. It matters how you act. But also to say, we're not sinking, right? There's degrees of severity from the impacts of climate change, and that we can make a difference with every bit of effort, even if we're slipping from interim or long-term targets. So I think you just got to keep at it. And at Ford, part of what I've really enjoyed just starting this year is to get a little bit at the hearts and minds of people out there. There's a lot of preconceived notions about brands, about types of vehicles. It's because it's a major consumer product, usually the most expensive people own. And they, it's not my experience, but people are like, well, we're a Dodge family. Okay. Like it's a religion, and that's okay. We can work with that, but it's fun to change and invite more people and to rethink some of those preconceived notions as Ford and as companies all across the world are really reinventing themselves and bringing much more exciting products and ones that actually align with both the consumer need, want, and the climate case. And so that's really fun, making people feel better about what they're driving.
Amazing.
I would say that as companies, we have to map out situations, right? We have to measure risk. We have to, plan so that, they say if you don't plan to fail, then you fail. If you fail to plan, then you plan to fail, right? Mm-hmm. And so ensuring that you've mapped out every scenario, knowing that some things take decades, some things that you are working towards will take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but you don't just give up or just walk away, because at MasterCard, we strive for an inclusive global economy and one that is sustainable. And the efforts that we bring to the table show that and speak to that. And so we are going to keep working towards the goals with the commitments that we have made. And we'll see where things go. But you still have to ensure that you are working towards the goals that you have made.
I think this is an incredible time to be alive, right? I think there's a lot of reason for opportunity. There's a lot of reason to believe that in the future of things, that these, from a science perspective, we have some incredible tools to address the challenges that lie in front of us to affect and to make change. From a society perspective too, we have these institutions to do this. Chris mentioned that I used to work for cooperatives, farmer cooperatives for probably about 10 years in total in my background. There's a lot of these opportunities where we can come together and work and share risk, share opportunity. And I think, you still see it definitely very much in the farmer landscape, not only in the US, but globally. I think there's some of this opportunity for leadership, which really excites me. And then, kind of going back to the science space, right, that I just kind of, Carl Sagan's view that we are in this technological adolescence, that there is still a tremendous amount we don't know about the world, but there's a lot we do know, and a lot of technology that we can apply and develop and understand. And I am very excited when I think about the future and our ability, just even look at the last 5 years. I know last few years have been a little rough, but at that same time, we have vaccines, we have technology, we have testing, we have so many other things that have come about in the space that really create some opportunity.
Thank you. The last question that I have is around equity. So what we do know about climate change is that it is poised to impact the most vulnerable communities, minority communities, the harshest. We've seen at a regulatory and federal level, we've seen the Biden administration create a special department that's focused on environmental justice. How are companies thinking about climate innovation in a corporate sense from that environmental justice lens? And given your vast experience, Kendra, on diversity and social justice issues, I would love to start with you to help us frame the discussion.
Sure. So I appreciate you asking that question. Environmental justice is near and dear to my heart. And the irony is that I ended up as Chief of Staff for Congressman Butterfield, and of course, our EPA Administrator, hails from North Carolina. And so I'm grateful to have worked in the space, even as a student. I didn't say I'm a graduate, class of 2012. I see my colleague here, yes, VLGS. And I'm very grateful to just recognize, that the environmental justice movement started in North Carolina, right, in Wake County. And so I think that for us as a company, we are always looking through the lens of how we ensure we build inclusivity and access into not only our products, but our work streams, our programming. So what does that mean for the globe? What does that mean for the environment? It means that, with our carbon calculator, it means that we're enabling people to have access to see what their carbon footprint is, right? That's one thing that you can see. It's on our website. In our commitments, we want to ensure that everybody has equal opportunity to be a part of the work that we're doing. On the financial services side, on the other side, we have so many financial literacy ways that we are fostering programming, but also educating people on the work that we do as a company. I work right at the intersection of social justice in our company. So what does that mean for DEI? What does that mean for how we're showing up as a company? And for us, it means that in all the decision-making that we do, because I think we've spoken a lot about our external commitments, but the internal decision-making that happens at our entities, it matters who's at the table, it matters whose perspectives are shared. And so I think that as we look to be more inclusive as a company, ensuring that internally, like who our outside counsel is, right? Ensuring that our supplier diversity is what it needs to be, right? As companies who are working across the globe. And so I think that sausage making, right, has to also come into bear when we talk about what are the decisions, what are the commitments, and then how did you get there? Who was at the table? There have been so many different things that have happened as a result of what clearly who was not in the room, right? In a lot of situations. I won't name any. I know this is live, so I won't name any companies.
We'll just edit
but
it out.
Yeah, but sometimes when you see things happen, you just wonder, like, was anybody in the room? Did anybody think that this was not a good idea, right? Mm-hmm. So I say that to say that as we all work towards our sustainability efforts and our goals, we also have to look internal to ensure that we have at the table who needs to be there because of the communities that we're impacting. So that's what I would share.
Amazing. Jesse, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think Kendra said it really best in terms of making sure that you have the right people, right? Mm-hmm. It's the idea of kind of thinking maybe holistically about ESG and making sure that you have, the voices at the table. Mm-hmm. As a company, we definitely have measurements and elements and to make sure that we have that representation on that decision making and that governance to make those views heard. I think, and then that carries through, and then that, one of the things that we also focus on a lot is then kind of other groups, right? And for us in the ag space, we think about smallholder farmers. And this is the energy group, so I'll raise this. This might be in that some of the ways to address climate and energy are really good for the big farmers. But in the U.S., think about this, we have about 30,000 dairy farmers. There's only about 300 generation facilities from methane that are out there. But all this, all 30,000 can buy a feed additive or have access to something. So we want to make sure that, if we do bring a technology forward, that there is an access component. So that way there's equal access to the opportunity to benefit from any of the changes or benefits that might be out there on something like this, whether it's this or other areas. So I think governance and access are key.
Yeah, to round it out, I guess I would just say something about stakeholder engagement, right? So within the company, absolutely, but it's really important that there be a genuine exchange of some kind. There's so many different ways to do it, but there needs to be outside critical groups, with real authority, with real voice, who can hold the corporation accountable. And at Ford, we do our best to invite them in. I was in Dearborn the last couple of days. We've got this thing called the Blue Table Series. Everything at Ford's blue, so it's called the Blue Table Series. And so we have, basically every major environmental organization, a lot of social justice organizations who are, full-fledged members, and we come in, there's social events, and then there's, really hard dialogue. We have these moments where, Human Rights Watch is asking our VP for purchasing about where are we getting our cobalt. And, right, that's a hard question for Ford right now, but we make ourselves a little more vulnerable, and we just learn so much faster. And then there's all these other collaborations that start to happen, and that kind of exchange requires a lot of investment by the company to make that really happen, and not just in the sort of normal sort of lobbying letters or whatever from one office to the next. Actual personal connections make a huge difference. And one of the main focuses is equity. It's cross-cutting. It's all over the place. And EVs are expensive, but new cars are expensive too. And a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford a new car, whatever its drivetrain might be. And so how is it, what else? You got to look beyond just the product itself. And so there's a lot of jobs coming. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of air quality benefits. And so, we're trying to figure out strategically how to really put that in place and do it with the input from all the thinkers out there who are bird dogging us pretty hard. It's disarming when they come in and you realize just how much they understand their business and are ready to problem solve with you.
Oh, I just wanted to add one additional thing in addition to what my colleague here has shared, and I appreciate him sharing. At MasterCard, everything is red and orange.
Okay.
But one thing that we have also done, and I wanted to ensure that I shared this, we tied our executive compensation to the ESG goals. And it's a critical shift that has happened within the company. And that includes equity, it includes DEI, and it really, really, really matters. And we had to show how it mattered and why it was so important. And so just wanted to ensure that I shared that. And then we also, just one major program that we have is called our In Solidarity program, which is our global response, which was set forth on June the 25th, 2020, in response to the racism that we saw and continue, right, to see happening across the, so that is a US-based, program, but it has impact in communities across our nation. And so I think that when you look at, when companies really do things that really matter in communities, when we look at what ESG goals and commitments are made, I think that, and I love what you shared, that Ford does relative to bringing in social justice groups. It's critically important, and it shows how we're all making a difference. So I just wanted to share that.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Kendra. So at this point, I would love to offer the opportunity for folks that are in here or virtually to ask questions to our amazing panel.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
My question for all of you is your organization involved in directly purchasing clean energy? If so, why or why not?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll start. So yes, we are. We have a commitment for 2040 to be 100% net in the, I say net, and I'll explain the net because the net's an important part, especially for this audience. Our largest facility is 100% right now, and then we are on our way. So that represents about probably 20% of where we are overall for goal. And we would definitely, and most of that is wind, might even be some of your wind because it's up in Kiel in Germany. But I think part of the challenge is that we face a number of state and local regulations too. Some of our facilities are in coal country. And so we are, but we will, we've made a commitment to purchase offsets to go through that process and look at a number of those things, but we are definitely trying to move in that direction, and we've made a commitment.
So I'll say yes, and I had to look because I wanted to verify. So we actually moved ours ahead. So we moved it from 2050 to 2040. So we have made the shift, but the answer is yes, and it's extremely important to us.
And, right, Ford is absolutely directly purchasing power for our facilities around the world. But just 2 months ago, I think we announced a deal with DTE, which is going to increase the amount of solar in Michigan by 70%, such that we will be making all vehicles made in Michigan with solar power, or at least we're going to directly purchase that amount of electricity to go on the grid. And so we really try, both with our facilities and with our vehicles, to comply without buying or selling credits. There's a few minor exceptions, but it is not part of the compliance strategy, compliance with regulatory or compliance with our own goals on climate. And so we like to comply directly and not play the game, which is sometimes reliable. I don't have any problems with credits. It's just that sometimes you're not so sure, and it sure is simpler when you can just say things like, we're buying a lot of solar in Michigan. And so that works for us, and so we're definitely going to keep doing that until we're zero emissions.
Yeah. I will chime in. TransUnion also is purchasing renewable energy, and as part of our climate commitments, we're looking to increase that for our own premises as well as for our lease spaces. So
thanks.
Thank you for the question. Anyone else in the audience?
Thank you. I primarily work in the public utility regulatory space, and I would say corporations have been useful allies to the extent that we can collaborate in renewable energy, clean energy, resource planning sort of dockets. And my question sort of revolves around the idea of how you all are trying to invite stakeholders in for engagement, but where else are you planning corporations to go to engage themselves? Are there other forms outside of public utilities, commissions at state levels that you can see yourself engaging in, whether that's like a planned zoning board or a planning committee at a municipality, just other areas and arenas where could be collaboration between environmental organizations and corporations where our interests align?
I'll just start very briefly to say that for us, it is very localized based on where we have physical employees and where we have offices. Our two main hubs are outside of St. Louis in O'Fallon, and then also, of course, in Westchester County in Purchase, New York. So for us, that is something that's definitely done at the localized efforts through our individuals who do the building control and maintenance. And so for us, at that particular level, it really is based on where we have the physical structures, which is throughout the world, right? But based on here in the U.S., that's done at a localized level. Yes.
This is Bruce Piasecki in Saratoga. I have a question, if I might, for the person who mentioned that DTE is working with them to produce all vehicles in the future in Michigan with solar. I think it'd be good for this audience of 34 people for that gentleman to talk a little bit more about how the levers of change enabled that. And because I think it brings together how innovative companies work with billion-dollar giants like the old Detroit Edison. So let me frame the question a little bit deeper. The vice president at DTE. Sean Patterson has been a client of my firm. I worked on ESG training at the DTE 10 years ago with a Hess executive for the leaders first, and then for hundreds of DTE people that didn't know, really, they were utility engineers, how to say the words environment, social, or governance. So I think it would help if the individual who talked about this amazing step forward, this is a great piece of news that you just reported, that all vehicles of the future will be supplied with renewable. Could you talk about what role your firm played with DTE? What were the levers of change? What was the pace of change? Because that's a great piece of news.
Thank you for the question, Bruce. But Kim, I think, Evan, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'll take them both.
Yeah,
I'll take them both, sure. Well, first to the DTE work. So Ford is based in Michigan, and so DTE has been a long-time power provider, and so that there was plenty of established relationship there. I didn't work on that particular deal, so I can't say for sure that there was any particular need for that to happen on DTE's side, but there sure was on the Ford side, because again, we're committed to powering our facilities with clean energy and eventually zero emission, globally. And so, certainly one of the things that changed was price of solar going down and making that feasible and being able to get to the place where we could make the business case for that kind of investment to actually achieve 100%. Because there have been smaller examples of that over the years, but it's a win-win. DTE needs to have reliable generation. They need to have reliable infrastructure in place, and having large buyers like Ford, that serves their long-term goals. So I think it's all about the long-term view. To the question posed before about collaborations, it is very much about where we are. And so right now, one of our biggest projects is in Tennessee and Kentucky. We're investing about $11.5 billion in a brand new greenfield manufacturing facilities. These are going to make batteries for electric vehicles, and they're going to make electric vehicles. And it's in an area that's about 30 miles outside of Memphis, where there's not a lot there, and it is a really big deal for that entire region. And so we have people on the ground full-time engaging directly with those communities. We just announced grant opportunities that are geared toward funding some of the goals that they have in mind in the midst of all of this change that we're bringing to their area. And yeah, at a hyper-local level, there's abundant opportunity for collaboration, but it requires that we have people who know, by and large, we're from Kentucky or Tennessee, who know the area, who work for us and have the authority and the agency to actually do something about it. So
Evan, can I tell you what I heard of that important piece of social history? I think you explained that Ford needed to make something happen, and then DTE served as the enabler of that something, and that's the essence. But will DTE then be able to take the leadership of Ford and require it for all auto manufacturers in their service area? Do you know if that is the intent? Because that would be an example for me of how things are moving faster than the laws and faster than we train how to change the laws. It would be a perfect example of how your leadership at Ford with a need was enabled by a utility that was willing, right? It had the proper senior management and the proper set of needs. But does it cascade to the rest of automakers like GM and the others in Detroit as well? Because, DTE serves all of them.
So I think the collaboration with DTE was very strong, but it wasn't a requirement from them. I presume our competitors are under some of the same outside pressures. I'm not so sure about internal drive, but outside pressures include increasingly, very constructive and critical input from shareholders who want to see that we're doing better and better, and and just stakeholders generally who are looking to make sure that we are doing our best to be sustainable. And so
I want to thank Evan your leadership. I mean, not only is it amazing what you can do in a brown belt area like Detroit, but the fact that you can do the greenfields in Tennessee and Kentucky, that's really encouraging. So I just wanted to thank you and pause you to get more into that so that the younger people, you know, I've been at this for 40 years, so I think there's a lot of lessons to unpack from what you said, Evan. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's move on to potentially some other questions that I think we may have over here.
Hi there. Hi there. So really excited about this partnership that you have with Duke and with the owners of the vehicles. I was literally writing down, can EVs be like a virtual power plant when you started talking about that? So I'm curious if you can kind of talk about maybe like why North Carolina, or some of the regulatory hurdles that you might have faced, or other challenges that maybe you didn't think of before and then they came up later.
Yeah, and I'm something of a sidekick to my colleague who really leads this work. But Duke's a major utility, and they had there was an existing conversation going, and we had manufacturing in their service territory, and so as most things go, it comes down to some personal connections about who raises the idea and where that gets traction. It's not just Duke. We are doing a demonstration. I wouldn't call it a pilot, more like a demonstration to prove the vehicle to home and then vehicle to grid technology through EPRI. We have similar collaborations to what I described with Duke that's happening with California. And so, there's a lot of those regulators that are more proactive are those utilities that are more proactive are calling, and they're trying to figure out what to do about electric vehicles. And many of them are coming with the right attitude that this is an opportunity. And not just an opportunity to justify significant capital investments, but an opportunity to really think more holistically about where electricity is. And the F-150 Lightning has 131 kilowatt hour battery, and we lead on commercial applications. Besides just people in their homes, you think about the number of fleets that are going to go electric, that are going to be plugged in all the time. School buses too. We're not in the bus market, and there's just tremendous opportunity there, and potentially significantly lower cost availability of electricity as compared to whatever the other choices happen to be. And you all know better than me it's very regional specific and grid specific. But we're going to see more and more and more electric vehicles on the market, and they're going to be wherever people drive them. But if they're plugged in, and if that person who owns it is willing and able to participate in some kind of a program, maybe it's on a regular basis. You can charge at night when it's cheap, and then you could power your house during dinner time off your truck instead of off your grid. And maybe that, if you make it really easy, you can just end up saving money that way. And that's not even vehicle to grid. That's just backing up your home. The obvious examples are during severe weather events or when the grid is out, and it can be a tremendous resource. So we're talking to a municipality right now who's buying some trucks, and they say, well, we need them for landscaping, but we're not going to be landscaping in the event of a hurricane. And so that right away they're seeing tremendous more value in the product itself as a resource for electricity, albeit not grid tied in a situation like that. And so right now there's again, I mentioned before, there's just this marrying of policy circles that usually have been sort of separate. And so increasingly we're aligned with and thinking like those companies who are doing other distributed energy resource projects or products that that are more grid tied and more traditional. But EVs are going to be that too, and eventually they're probably all going to be bidirectional, like Ford's trucks are.
Do we have any other questions, Kevin?
Yeah, I've got a few from the live streamers. So the first one is probably good for this point in the middle of the afternoon. How can energy or climate innovators follow BP's lead and react appropriately to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine?
Well, we had a joint venture in Russia, and we ceased operations when the war began, and we just a couple weeks ago, I think, announced that we spun it off and we're done.
So likewise, we ceased operations actually at the same time as Visa. it was on the same day. It was a Saturday, I remember. It was in March. We seized our operations in Russia, and they have not resumed. That's what we did.
We do not have kind of a business over there, but we do have a sales. So we did retain our sales over there, but we only health products is what we provide this time.
Yeah, I will say TransUnion didn't have operations in Russia, but what we did do is donated resources and human rights aid to the Red Cross of Ukraine. So,
and I want to clarify, when I say cease operations, our payment platform was no longer valid, right? In Russia, we have employees who are there. We have employees who were in Ukraine. They are no longer there. We ensured that they were no longer there in Ukraine, but we stopped the payment platform.
And I've got two more. Both are directed toward Ford, but I'll broaden the first one to everyone. So, Evan, what's driving Ford's commitment to EV? Is it driven by regulatory concerns, federal law, international accords, et cetera, or consumer demand, or I guess by something else? And then I'll just broaden it for the other panelists. What's really driving your commitment to climate action?
As always, it's a number of things. For a long time, the auto industry as a whole was making electric vehicles to placate regulators, and we see with the current technology an opportunity to completely abandon that and make vehicles that are pure electric, that are just what people are going to want. And for those of you who haven't driven an electric vehicle, you need to, and you're going to realize what I'm talking about. No, people aren't going to go back. And there's enough other studies from other parts of the world that show that we've already reached a tipping point. Even though we're at like 5% EV adoption, it's just a better product. And so, this guy stopped me. He's driving an old pickup truck, and he says, "Is this pickup truck?" I was driving an electric. He says, "Well, is it as powerful?" I said, "It's the most powerful F-150 ever." It's and all the reviews are, it's just a better product. So that's a lot of it, but obviously it aligns with our climate goals. We see significant business risk in continuing to make a product with significant, tier 3 emissions. Just long term, that's not in the best interest for our shareholders, and it's good for the brand, right? Broadly. So yeah, there's a number of factors, of course, and timing and sequence and all the rest are really meticulously planned and replanned all the time as far as how quickly we're going to ramp up EVs and ramp down ICE vehicles, internal combustion vehicles. But it's definitely in full swing, and we're doing it as fast as we can.
So I would share what drives the work that we do is that we really want to be the global citizen that we are called to be. And, doing well by doing good does not just mean that we are doing well, from a business perspective. Yes, that is the bottom line, right? Because we have to be profitable, but we have to do well to our planet. We have employees who live in communities. We all live in at least one community, right? And if this is our planet, we have to take care of it, period. We have the Sustainability Innovation Lab, which is fostering efforts in R&D to see how we make global innovations relative to sustainability goals. And that's just one of the ways that we are really at the table moving forward our work and our commitments. So that's why it's important to us. One of the reasons.
To build on this and maybe even to kind of re-anchor, this is a University of Vermont law school, and University of Vermont was a land grant university. And a lot of the land grants invested in food and making sure that we had, maybe as part of our national security, but also to help the young nation grow. And I think there is a desire in terms of how do we develop that in a way that so we can be long-term productive in a sustainable way for a very long period of time. And that's where a lot of that research goes to. I think very specifically for us, what drives us is I would say we hear very loudly from our customer community. There's a lot of customer advocacy for more tools, more desire for us to be active in this space and have a broad, inclusive platform in this area. Last week, visited with a a co-op manager from Pacific Northwest who said he is losing sales internationally because they can't fully articulate their methane production relevant to other international providers. I think they're competing with New Zealand, and they want to say that we're doing something better. And so there is some good competitive pressure out there that is kind of driving some of this, as well as the desire to do this. But I think it's part of that larger inclusive goals. Like, how do we continue to evolve our enterprises so that way we do represent it?
I will add, also from TransUnion's perspective, for those of you that are unfamiliar, it's a data and insights company. Similar to what Kendra was alluding to, a lot of the work that we do is because it anchors back to our sense of purpose and corporate responsibility. And our particular take on it is information for good. So part of that responsibility is also delivering on our climate commitments. This being said, there are a lot of synergies around us addressing climate change through some of the business initiatives that we have. For example, we have a real estate consolidation strategy because we are a technology company to only have the buildings that we really do need. And so that in itself helps reduce the impact that we have from office space. Similarly, we've made a massive commitment to migrating to the cloud, which makes for much more efficient data processing. It helps with cybersecurity. And then at the same time, many of the partners that we have been selecting are around, have their own climate change commitments. So large technology companies that you would easily recognize. So that is some of the ways in which climate commitments really align to what we're trying to do as a business, and also driving that bottom line.
Okay, and the final question I have from our live stream audience is directed toward Ford, but I'm going to broaden it a little bit too. They're curious whether Ford is intending to make a play in hydrogen, and noting that some of your competitors are only into EVs, but others, focusing on hydrogen. And I would just ask, whether any of your other companies, whether hydrogen as a fuel is impacting, business in any way.
Yeah, I think, broadly, the question is about, do you put all your eggs in one basket, especially if you're really moving away from one particular way of doing business? So we're not considering hydrogen for our light duty cars. We make a lot of trucks. We power, leaving aside the largest trucks on the road, we dominate the van and pickup and large pickup truck market. Most of just look around, it's incredible how many of the commercial vehicles are Ford. Those are a lot harder to electrify. They can be electric, but they can't necessarily at the same time meet the customer expectations on utility and price at the same time. And that just goes to the energy density of current battery technology compared to liquid fuels. And so hydrogen is definitely a possibility for some of the heavier products, but we're going to focus predominantly on electrifying our lighter products, including big trucks, but not the biggest yet.
I'll just say, I don't know that we've made a commitment relative to hydrogen. So I would say that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lots of other things, but not necessarily hydrogen.
Yeah, for us, I don't think we've done anything related to hydrogen, but I didn't, maybe in broadening the response back a little bit, is that, one of the conversations we do have, we talk about diversity of energy sources. I think especially kind of looking at, what has happened in the last, 6 to 12 months globally, especially following Russia's invasion, that you have, natural gas, certain, definitely certain distillates, other fuels that really have spiked in terms of prices. And so there's a benefit to having diverse sources of energy to be able to meet your needs. And so we've definitely had that conversation as part of our thoughts and approach.
Excellent. I think we can all agree that this has been an invigorating conversation. And so I'd like to pass it to our panelists for some final remarks before we close the panel. So, Evan.
I guess what's on my mind is that I've just benefited so much from talking to other VLGS people who are further ahead in their career or behind, my years in my career. And I hope to be in touch with all of you. And we need to keep that up because DC is something like a second home for us.
I would say it's wonderful to see everyone also. There's so many ways that we can have intersectionality in all the work that we do. So please look to us as a resource, and look forward to staying in touch with everyone.
I am not an alum of it. I feel
We still like you.
right.
Adopted.
No, but I definitely do appreciate the panel, and I think it's really great that the school does this. I think it's really quite unique in that you develop this culture, right? And so much of DC is about your network and who you know, and this is a very powerful opportunity. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you. So join me.
Here's your advanced warning. We're going to move to audience questions after this question. So put your thinking caps on. Next Tuesday, we have an important election. What's going on? Don't forget to vote. Register.
My World Series, isn't that?
Oh, yeah, that too. That too. Talk a little bit about what you think, if any, changes might come about if Democrats lose control of one or both houses of Congress. What does that portend for all of the investments brought by the IRA? If anything, frankly, I think, and I'll just offer my own bit of experience here. I think once the federal government offers a tax credit, it's actually really, really hard to roll it back. And I think you may have mentioned this earlier. Often the fight is around, let's extend it. We need to extend it. We need to extend it. And, you look at the biofuel credit, for example. It's like the one that will never die, even though we're just really not going to biofuels. But there's a really entrenched interest there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start. It might be easier for me to talk than you, but
you can be excused from this if you want.
I was going to say, all it means to me is oversight. Yeah. Well, that's actually where I was going.
That's
is
true.
that one big difference between tax credits and spending programs is the tax credits are essentially automatic, and just companies out anywhere in the country will just go and quietly file what they did on their tax returns, and nobody will ever see, and there'll be nobody in Washington even aware of it. No decision maker at any agency that can get hauled into a hearing about it. It just happens. It's just out there, and it's under everybody's radar. Whereas a government program, I mean, the obvious, notable example is Solyndra. I mean, if a party wants to find a problem with an administration's action, they will find the one mistake, even if it, wasn't really a mistake, even if it was a perfectly fine investment or decision based on the facts at the time. So, I worry about that. Is that, what's going to be the Solyndra of the next time? Surely you can find something to, at least raise issues about or get on the news. Mm-hmm. So I think we will see that. In terms of legislation, I just think we're just not going to see anything meaningful, so we'll be shut down.
Yeah, anything to add on that?
No, I was kind of being glib before, but I mean, from my perspective, I don't really, foresee a change in any new legislation, as long as the White House is still Democratic, and for us at EPA, changing party can mean additional oversight, and that's something that, we just are accustomed to dealing with. So I don't really have a lot more to say about it than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I might just add, in terms of advocacy efforts on behalf of large energy customers, that it's more of just a shift of forum. Like Rob said, the last 2 years we've had this phenomenal opportunity, and it's been really important to be there and to be active. But I think in terms of what happens should the House or Senate or both change hands, is just you look at what forums are going to be most impactful for you to be able to advocate within. So that might mean you start focusing more on state public utility commissions. It might mean you start working closer with utilities in developing partnerships that way. So I think it's still, back to the first panel and talking about optimism, I think it's still a reason to be optimistic. It just might mean your opportunities for advocacy change a little bit, where you do them and how you do them.
Yeah, it does feel very much like we're about to go to Egypt at COP, and it's branded an implementation COP. It feels that way here too, right? Like we've set the course, we've sent the signal, and now we got to figure out how to implement it. We got to figure out how to get enough transmission, right, on the grid. There are problems to solve here, right? How do we meet the criteria of the tax credits to get the investment that we need going? I will note one thing that I've observed, which is almost immediately after the IRA was signed into law, there was this raft of announcements, and I'm most focused in the transportation space, but I think it's been similar in other energy sectors as well. In red states, in deep red, Tennessee, Oklahoma, that's where the manufacturing is going, because there are all kinds of other incentives to put that investment there that can be leveraged on top of the IRA. So I think that also might inform the political dynamic we might see here when we have a more bipartisan leadership in government, perhaps for the next 2 years. Okay, now it's your turn. What questions do you have for our panelists? Please.
Hi, Rob.
Go ahead and share your name and affiliation if you don't mind.
Oh, Michelle Eisenhower Hanlon. I am a Merrill candidate. I'm supposed to graduate next year. I work in consulting. I'm interested, Rob, in your opinion on T&D kind of got shorted. Probably not going to get any new legislation. We've talked about EVs and V2G. We've talked about all of these tax credits coming out. What are you seeing or anticipate seeing RTOs, ISOs, states, private sector doing to address this, right? There is an opportunity and a risk, and I am been trying to track this. I'm super interested in your answer.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, both transmission and distribution will require a lot of investment. Of course, distribution goes under state authority, so there'll be, a lot of action at the state regulatory commissions. Electrification, charging stations, just, a lot of EVs on a local, feeder in a neighborhood. They'll have to upgrade those lines. There'll be a lot of upgrades. A lot of distribution systems are old and need upgrade anyway. A lot of them also need sort of resilience-related, severe weather protection. So it can be a lot of investment. I think by and large, there is a mechanism in those cases to decide on those investments and recover the costs. The standard, public utility model, independent regulatory commission, usually cost of service regulation, they can do that. I hope they do it smartly with more, advanced or whatever you want to call the rate design, so that we're not all charging our EV when we get home, but shifting it to midnight or something. There's just a lot of simple things that are just almost no-brainers that could be done and should be done. But the dollars involved will be a challenge. So I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just, it's going to be a big discussion debate with, consumer advocates and utilities in the state level proceedings. Moving bigger to transmission, there are generally ways to, get transmission, sort of local transmission built and similar, cost recovery, in that case, sort of shared jurisdiction through the state and FERC. But what's missing and what's really hard to me is the large regional and interregional type lines. Like the electric industry was not built up to build those things. The old, Sam Insold, utility model was sort of local generation, local T&D serving the customer, and you have these vertical silos all over the country, like 1,000 of them. And then we built up in more recent years some interconnections, but just sort of minimal, just in the worst case scenario you can share with your neighbor. But they weren't really built to withstand and hold the large, much of the load, of a lot of the generation being, remote from the load, and to shift power back and forth, because if it's cloudy over here, then you're shipping power there, and the reverse as the weather changes or the wind's blowing always somewhere, and you move it around. So that's the grid we need, and we still are not well equipped. FERC can do a lot within its authority to advance that. And so now, since we didn't get much help from taxpayers, now we really need that even more than we thought. And so FERC, and under its current leadership, I think is doing, the right things and trying on that. But they haven't even started on interregional transmission, and I'm not sure they even really know what they're going to do on that, because that's really hard, because you have all these dollars that everybody across, let's say, 20 states benefit from, but nobody's raising their hand to say, hey, we'll do it. We had a couple innovations. New Jersey just did what's called a state agreement approach. So everybody in New Jersey can pay, but then, if you're building these lines that a lot of other states will benefit from, it's hard to see a lot of states raising their hands saying, why don't I pay for that public good that everybody will benefit from? So that's that's really the still remaining task. And it's a rich area. You should go work on this when you graduate. There's a lot of, interesting substantive engineering, economics, policy, law, and all that. But I think we're just trying to kind of cobble together, how do we get regional planning, interregional planning, and cost allocation. We haven't even talked about permitting, but that's another area. We can talk about the permitting bill, by the way, if we want to, but that could pass here at the end of the year. But that's where we are. That's what we have to focus on.
Love to talk about permitting, actually, but we've got one more question here.
Well, I was going to ask a question about that.
Oh, good.
Actually, I have two questions. One for Matt, since Rob's been talking a lot. I'll go first with Matt. But I'm wondering what the timeline is. All my clients are asking me, like, when is the guidance going to come out? And obviously it's not just EPA, it's DOE, it's the IRS. But is there any? Can you just make me a promise right now that it will all be done by a certain date?
What guidance are you referring to?
I mean, like how the agencies are gonna implement the legislation.
There are about 28 different documents that you could be referring to because that's how much it covers, right?
I don't know that we're going to have some, master roadmap. This is how we're going to implement the IRA. There's a lot of different programs. There were some deadlines in, a few of the new provisions of the Clean Air Act. So I referred earlier to Section 136, which has the methane fee. There was a statutory deadline, I believe, maybe, the end of 2024 or something like that, where Congress said, by that date, you need to go revise your greenhouse gas reporting program rules in order to basically make them compatible with this new fee program we've just created. I think that, we are obviously thinking hard about what additional regulations or guidance will we need to implement that program. There's, we don't have a timeline necessarily for that yet, but the fee, kicks in 2024. So obviously that provides, a bit of a goalpost, if you will. So I think there's going to be a lot of, potential rulemaking and guidance that comes out of this, and I can't really speak to any specific timing. It'll really be dependent on the program.
You know about IRS and the tax credits? I don't really know. It's really, a lot of people are working hard. Are you?
Yeah, we're really engaged on this. That's why I was wondering if that's maybe what you were asking about, because so much of the IRA for the clean energy provisions are these tax credits. And they've just done, many of you may be working on this, a couple weeks ago, they put out their first round of requests for information on most of the tax credits, but not all of them. And just today, they've released two more. The 30D, the light duty vehicle credit RFI, was a major part of the first batch. Now they're into the commercial vehicle credit and some of the other ones. And so I think they are working very quickly, that says to me, on taking input on how they need to implement these provisions. I think I would flag that, there are some fairly prescriptive provisions in these tax credits, though. And so I think, there is this sense among industry of like, there's only so much we can do. I think we have a pretty good roadmap with the language that's right there in the text. But then there are some other pieces like the domestic content requirements for many of these credits that folks really do want to try to find a way to work through because, really are going to slow the benefit of the investment if you really take a heavy hand on enforcing those.
Yeah, I think now I can think of the EPA policy that I get asked about the most, which I'm assuming is going to come out of EPA, although it's not entirely clear, which is I think in 2025 it goes fuel neutral as some of these tax credits, and then it's like based on life cycle carbon, and it sounded a lot to me like in the renewable fuel sort of pathway process for RINs, which is esoteric, but basically the only thing I could think of where EPA is actually sort of technology choosing based on that. And so I don't know if that is a question we get a lot from startups and other companies, like, how do I know if my technology is going to be able to get those credits? And I think it's 2025 is not that far away.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
It's okay. That's okay.
But I think you're hitting on something really important there, which is that this is such a large piece of legislation that there are many deals that are being kind of walked half a step back because everybody needs to do this new analysis with this new landscape that we're working with. I think it was yesterday or a couple of days ago that a storage company said, we're putting 2 deals on hold right now because we need to fully understand how this is going to change everything that we've modeled out from the previous regime. So I don't have an answer, but we should highlight how important it is.
Rod, this should be music to your ears in terms of recruitment, because there's going to be a lot of work for environmental lawyers to do. Yes.
So I did also, and then I'll give up the mic, have a question about the permitting bill you referred to. I've been living transmission and the very difficult nature of getting it approved. And I saw the first draft of that bill that came out and was like, oh, this would make a huge difference. And then it went away. And I'm wondering, do you have any insight on, is it possible that that will get passed?
Yeah, so there was the kind of the one-page deal between Senator Manchin and Schumer, Biden, Pelosi. I think most Democrats were willing to support that, but they needed some Republican votes. They did get a commitment. Manchin got a commitment from Schumer in September to put it on the CR. I think like if he had the votes or Republican votes, I think he just fell a little bit short on the Republican Senate votes. So they pulled it back. He pulled it back in September. There are a couple of end-of-year legislative opportunities, must-pass legislation to which that could be attached. But again, the question is, do they have the votes? There's challenges on both the left and the right on that. I think it's a pretty rare and significant situation that we have Democratic leadership basically signed on. Again, if it sticks with that deal, they already agreed to sort of the one-page version of that. So, and there was language, sort of floated back then. So I think that is still basically the Manchin bill. He's trying to get support for that. Of course, on the Republican side, Senator Capito had the Republican version. I actually just met with her office this morning. And their idea back in September was, well, it's, here we are like a couple weeks from when we're supposed to pass this so-called bipartisan thing. We haven't seen any language because at that point they hadn't shared the actual language. So we're just going to put out our own wish list. Capito being on EPW, Environment and Public Works, but not on Energy and Natural Resources anymore. Her focus was on the EPW issues, NEPA related things and some various environmental laws that I don't know much about. I'm more of an ENR person. So really for that reason, her bill didn't have anything in the energy and natural resource domain, including transmission. It just didn't have transmission, but mainly because that's her area. So there are questions among the Republicans. I think I met with 3 or 4 of their offices today. Rodney, Portman, Capito, I forget who else. But, they're sort of wondering, what's the base for negotiation here? We have 6-7 weeks where we could possibly put something together. Nobody's really engaging before the election because everybody's looking to see, okay, what's our leverage after the election? Why do we agree to something now when our hand might be strengthened on November 8th, right? So nobody's really engaging it the way they need to get deals done. There's talk, there's a lot of staff talk about like the substance of and the language, which is fine. I mean, that's classic lame duck, preparing for lame duck. It's just that we don't really know yet, who might be willing to do a deal with who, and nobody's really showing their hand. They're all holding the cards close. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, it's hard for me personally to see a lot of Democrats going along with the Capito approach. So I don't know that like some kind of merging of the Capito Manchin. I sort of feel like, look, in lame duck, it's still the case that Democrats control the Senate, House, and White House. So and if you have this rare situation of Democratic leadership agreeing to significant permitting reform and you're Republican, wouldn't you kind of take that half a loaf of progress and sign on? At least that's my optimistic hope. I do think that bill would be good for transmission. And I know they listen to us, clean energy and transmission types in crafting it, and we got some good things in there. So, I'm hopeful it will stay there. And I also think that, if significant parts of that fall out, like even if Senator Manchin wanted to say, oh, the transmission part's complicated or controversial, let's take that out, then why would Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer go along? Like, they agreed to what was in there because it had good stuff for clean energy. If you take that out, there's no deal.
I mean, I'll also share a story. We were at the White House for the celebration of the IRA enactment, which I'm sure many of you were. It was me and 2,000 of my closest friends on the lawn there. And but we were right up front behind where all the elected officials were, and there was Markey dancing and taking pictures of the crowd and having fun. And Mom's Clean Air Force and other organizations were out there in force, and of course everybody was celebrating. But at every chance they could get, they would yell a congressperson's name or a senator's name, and they would pull them over and they would say, "Don't you pass that permitting bill. Don't you pass that bill. You're going to undermine everything we just did in IRA." So I think we can't ignore that undercurrent as well, because that's a strong component of the base. And so let's, anyway, just sharing that with you. Tracy, you've got something really good to say on this, and then I think we got to move to the keynote. Yeah.
Thank you, Just Tracy Lewis, JD 09, best class ever.
After
I'm very modest. I'm at Public Citizen, and so we're part of a pretty broad coalition with most of the big greens, and of course many BIPOC-led orgs, and we are 1,000% against this so-called permitting reform. One of the main reasons, of course, is because of the impacts that it would have on frontline communities, which I haven't heard anyone mention at all in any discussion here on the IRA, which is interesting. But what's most important and why this permitting bill will not go forth is because the opposition within the House is large enough to keep it out, and there's just enough Dems who are also against it. So unless the House really flips heavily Republican, or I'm sorry, the Senate flips heavily Republican, that's probably the only way that this will happen. If it stays in the Dems' hands and we add on folks like, Tim Ryan, what else? But Val Demings or Beasley or anything like that, and take power away from Manchin and Sinema, it's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. But that's just me.
I think you make a really interesting point, Tracy, and I think we have a few more minutes. Maestro? Okay, excellent. Thank you for raising the frontline communities piece of this, because I think it is really important. In my current role, I think of this in terms of commercial transportation primarily, because you've got 5% of the vehicles on the road are medium and heavy duty commercial vehicles, but they're almost a quarter of all the pollution, and that pollution is really centered in these frontline communities, right? Think of where all the delivery vans go. Think of where all the inland ports are for trucks carrying all the freight from all the Amazon that I order for my children. And I think it's really important that, there are some ways in which the IRA will benefit frontline communities immediately, right? That's one I think of almost immediately, but would love the perspective of the panelists, on some other things you're seeing there in response to Tracy's comments.
Yeah, sure. So there's definitely, in the EPA portion of the IRA, there is a lot of focus on frontline communities, low-income communities, communities of color. They've been historically disadvantaged by a lot of air pollution. So, one of the grant programs is like the Environment and Climate Justice Block Grants. It's setting them aside money specifically to go to address impacts in those types of communities. There's also a fair portion of money to go do fence line monitoring, which is something that's very important when you get these huge refineries or these other big sources of emissions that are in communities that are overburdened. It's often one of the most important tools they have is just having good information, like what is coming out of this thing. And fence line monitoring is the gold standard, and there's money for that. I'll also just say that, one thing that I was talking to one of my, colleagues about the bill just yesterday, and, he was making the good point that obviously a lot of folks, focus on, all of the greenhouse gas reductions that are projected to occur as a result of the IRA and the climate benefits. But, 90% of the air pollution in this country comes from the combustion of fossil fuels. And by fostering a transition away from those fuels, for example, coal-fired power plants and, different industrial sources that use these fuels. You're not just getting climate benefits, but you're getting benefits across the board, whether it's criteria pollutants like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, also hazardous air pollutants, which tend to, be a huge problem in overburdened communities. So the co-benefits of these programs is, they lead a transition towards, cleaner sources of energy. I think are going to pay huge dividends in that space.
Well, I'm glad you raised it also. In the power sector space, my understanding from just about every Democrat, including I spoke with Senator Sanders' office today, is like if it were the transmission part alone, they would be supportive. But there's obviously this permitting bill has a lot of fossil things in the MVP. So then it's tough for probably every Democrat except Manchin to how do you balance? And I think the problem is probably nobody had time. I mean, this thing was sprung upon everybody in early August, and they had to decide what they're going to do by end of September. I think a lot of them breathed a sigh of relief. They didn't have to vote because they still weren't quite sure, how bad is the bad compared to how good is the good. And I still think people need to do that. I mean, my own opinion, I think it's commonly held, but I can't prove that it's true right now, is that there are not going to be very many willing investors in large fossil pipelines in the future. I don't think there's just not the market for it. I mean, after MVP, which is already almost complete, who's going to invest in those? So if we make permitting a little easier on something that has no investment interest, you're not going to get that much fossil. Whereas clean energy, the entire clean energy transition is held up because of transmission, lack of transmission. So if we want, hundreds of gigawatts of wind and solar, we're going to need a lot of transmission. And the public health impacts of that are significant because there's a lot of dirty power plants in cities, and these old dirty power plants were, located close to disadvantaged communities because that's how things were done. And it's not carbon, it's particulates and NOx and public health and, asthma-inducing pollutants that are there. Well, the only way you can close those is so you get the clean energy, which happens to be remote, and you need the transmission, just like San Francisco did. They had the Transbay Cable, closed the dirty old power plant. Houston, LA Basin is trying to do this if they could get transmission into the LA Basin. New York is in the process of doing it because they got this upstate line bringing clean energy down into the city. And so, we have to have this transition. I recognize the gas part is hard. Natural gas is hard for a lot of people, but it is still displacing a lot of coal. So, I'm not sure even there if we get more gas, if it's necessarily a net carbon negative. Plus, we're shipping a lot of it to Europe, which needs it. So there's a national security angle. So anyway, it's a very complicated question, very legitimate points, and certainly, I'm not counting on a lot of House Democratic votes. Is going to be a tough one with all of them. But I think on balance it would be positive.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Rob. This doesn't solve all the problems, right? We want to celebrate. It's almost $70 billion, and it's important and it's historic. But we still have a lot more work to do. I was on CalSTART has an investor council, and we had a small group of 3 investors writing multi-$100 million checks on the call, talking about these issues and the impact of the IRA. And I thought it was really interesting. One of them said, everyone keeps telling me green hydrogen is going to be the next thing, right? When you think about what displaces gas, we got a $3 a kilogram credit, max credit in the IRA, which is astounding. And he's going, why? We didn't need $3, to do this, but there it is. And he said, I went to dig into it a little more, and what I found, right, this guy's job is to find out whether this technology is going to work, whether he wants to write a check to companies who are going to make this technology work. He goes, it's not going to work. I don't think it's going to work. And I said, well, I think that might be a little bit pessimistic, but I think it underscores the point, right? We haven't solved all the problems. Technology doesn't all work yet. We don't have enough transmission. But we're closer now than we were 3 months ago, and we're going to get ever closer, and this is going to accelerate the transition. So I think that's the thought I would leave you with. I would invite our panelists to leave you with similar concluding thoughts. May they be optimistic, please.
That sounds like a good way to end to me. I'll just second that.
All right, Matt, any final thoughts?
No, I definitely think we should be optimistic. I mean, I think that the fact that in the last couple of years we've had not one but two huge new pieces of legislation aimed at reducing dangerous climate pollution, and we'll also have benefits in many other ways and reducing other types of air pollutants and addressing other environmental concerns. But the first one I was referring to was the American Innovation Manufacturing Act, which is going to really help lead to the phasing out of HFCs. Now we have the IRA coming close on its coattails. It's a very exciting time. I just remember when I read the Washington Post alert that the deal was back on, like my jaw almost hit the floor. We heard it was dead, and all of a sudden it was back, and we were thinking like, wow, this is going to mean a lot for the agency, both for our existing work and also for a lot of new work we're doing. So I think that, I'm optimistic, and I think others should be too.
Jack, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think, especially seeing the progress that's been made first, I think 5 or 10 years ago, even just seeing the levels of penetration of variable generation that we have right now, a lot of grid operators thought that would kill the grid. It was going to just absolutely not work from a physics and engineering perspective. So I think that there are a tremendous amount of lessons learned over the last decade or 15 years that ultimately are going to be able to enable faster and better transition over the next 10 years. But as clearly illustrated, there are still a lot of really tricky issues to solve. And to do that, we need stakeholders who have excellent educations from VLGS, and also people who work across different stakeholder groups. I mean, we've seen developers, we've seen customers, we've seen PIOs. It's so valuable to have all these stakeholders coming together with the common goal of an energy transition.
Well said. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
All right, so now's the fun time when I get to introduce our keynote speaker. Tamara Toles is our keynote. She's an internationally recognized environmental advocate and climate strategist. She is the president and CEO of the Environmental Grant Makers Association, and she also used to lead 350.org. She was a North American director at 350.org and 350 Action. She has an amazing resume, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but I think we're all honored to have her here today to speak to us.
The first thing and most important thing that Bill owes me everything. I know he was recently in the community talking to folks, so I'd like to shop before I do it over now. I have a few things to say, and I'm glad the last panel ended where it did, because I think IRA is a really good starting point to talk about where we are now. Also, raise your hand if you can't hear me, because I'm going to keep this on, but I want to make sure folks can hear me. Okay, that helps. That helps tremendously. I'm just going to ask one other thing. So I'm going to say a lot in a pretty short period of time, and I want to share a bunch of information. I know it's like a shell of itself, literally.
Does anybody have the clicker? Not a clicker.
Okay. Huge surprise, the professor has the clicker.
Should be able to start it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, awesome.
Do you see your presentation? Escape.
Not at all.
Hold on, maybe he's.
I was gonna say we'll organize it. I'll also co-sign Tracy on flagging that the class of 09 is the greatest class that has ever or will ever exist at Vermont Law School. If you want to talk about it, message me on Twitter. Nobody else is there, so we can talk about it. That said, there are some really smart folks in this room who, when I first came to VLS, were thinking about things that other people 15 years later, like, oh, so that was a good thing that you went to that school in the mountain town. including other folks in New England who at the time said, what are you going to do for money if you go to that school? So by the time we graduated, they were like, apparently a lot. And so far, so good. So, no, all good. So I'm going to stubbornly keep calling it Vermont Law School until Rodney makes me leave, because I'm just old and I got to grow. But I think it's really important to put some flavor in the conversation around the energy parts, because I actually, because of my experience with the clinics at Vermont Law School, decided to do my MELP, mostly focused on energy generation and transmission in 2009, right? So I graduated in 2009 when it was even further from most folks' imagination that these two planks of work would be moving towards each other. And I think part of why that matters is because in order to do any of the community stuff that makes my goals matter and make people care about what I'm doing, I have to understand why it isn't happening. And for a law student, the closest we're going to get to engineering is energy work. So it was a really powerful combination then, and it is now, because the superpower of coming out of VLS is being able to explain to lots of folks who don't think these things are connected that they're totally wrong. And so that's largely what I end up doing, is having conversations with communities who are like, I have this problem and I have that problem. And the answer is actually, no, so FERC is your real problem, but we're not going to get there. So why don't we talk to the PSC, which is also hard, but your neighbor. And so much of my work has been about listening to people talk about the thing that's pulling on their heartstring and connecting them to the systemic part of that, and being able to point to energy generation and transmission, the work that we're doing, and not doing the experiments that happen more freely because of all the things that have been mentioned by the panelists around how a credit works in a way that can be less political and the different mechanisms. We've just tried more stuff in an area where the tech hasn't matched the policy, but the policy has been moving. So this is just a little bit in the background and bio and stuff you will find out about me if you Google it, a little bit about where I spend my time. Largely, is this better? Okay, thanks, T. That's my bestie. I met her in the South Royalton. She now works in the Department of Energy, so she's responsible for most of this content, just kidding. But flagging that, like, this work is new to a lot of people. So 12 folks got together in 1987 and decided that they were gonna start a philanthropy fund with 12 other folks, and now they fund $1.91 billion in capital moving to support these issues. And for them, so much of what we talked about today is pretty new, because they just wanted to, stop some bad stuff from happening or protect the species. And as it turns out, all of these things are really connected. So excited to see the folks in this room with various tenures and experience, because we're gonna need all of that. As much as we need lawyers to do work at scale, we need folks inside of it in order to make it work. And those folks are lawyers. So among the other things I do, I run a nonprofit, another nonprofit, which is really focused on making sure we don't burn people out as quickly as we bring them in, which is needed. Raise your hand if you've ever felt tired about the way you work, but you love it so much you can't stop. Okay, so we're in the right room. So this is a little bit of what I learned when I came out of VLS. So a part of being able to take these two different streams of my legal education and my master's education was really looking at the fact that if we're going to do the work of redesign, and lawyers are social engineers, we need to be in a lot of different disciplines at the same time in order to accomplish it. And doing that work has shown up in all the places where you will see me, but this is really what I'm trying to do in those spaces. And today, I think, circling back to the legislation of the hour and what I would call the floor, not the ceiling, of what we want to see done, these landscape issues have been on our desks since there were desks. So in the world of trying to resolve problems between people who need stuff and have to have energy to do it, we are in a deep conversation that is way ahead of most of us, and we still have to find relationships and practical solutions that usually happen in groups of folks who don't know each other very well. So in thinking about the robustness of the legal framework that we inherited, and a lot of the folks at Vermont Law School had a lot to do with building, frankly, that is not where we are now, not just because some of it has been beaten within an inch of its life and doesn't have a lot of regulatory legs, but because these things are still true. So we are still in a moment where the law of the land has a lot of stuff built in it that doesn't consider people. I wonder what's happening there or something. And so this little chart of all the laws we don't talk about undergirds what we're doing and makes it really difficult for us to talk about where we build things, who gets paid to do it, what kind of labor we're talking about, because the law itself is inherently, as a vehicle for change, flawed, leaves people out, and tends towards racism. And so all the folks in this space are going to have to think about that in the decisions that we make in order to make it so that we're not spending our time fighting about when we ask for something, who we ask for it with, and avoiding these root causes. So, and across all of what we are talking about today is racist standards, cultural norms of oppression, recognizing that the data is not only the part of the story that matters, but it comes from people who are experiencing it in the same way that it comes from qualitative reporting that we can show on a heat map and people feel really sexy about. So just flagging that we're all up against these things, regardless of the part of the work that we are in. And really making it even more difficult is that we are afraid of open questions across our work. I really like the way Jessica landed in discussing that, we are just some of the things we don't know. The technological pieces for energy, at least, are 30 years old. We have fought some of the fights around DAC. I'm going to use a lot of acronyms. We're in DC, so it's okay. DAC, CCS, and all the other pieces, because they've been around since the 70s. There are white papers on white papers fighting other white papers about why we didn't do it before. So the fact that we have exhausted all of our other chances, let the law outpace the work, is proof that this is not about where we are in the tech. It's about matching the tech to a design purpose that we all agree on. And so the other thing we'll have to do is talk to folks about it. And some of these folks who I learned about in my experience and outside of it have been doing the work of keeping the community in the conversation. So I'm just going to share a couple of their names and bios so that the folks in this room will know that it's more likely that you will connect with folks in this space if you understand who else has been connecting with them. If you want to make your work matter to people, you have to recognize that the folks who have built this work aren't just inventors and people who get patents, but people who do social engineering with and without degrees, and connecting with their legacies. Some of them are still alive, very few, but they have done the work of networking the places and the people that will be required to make the change that technology cannot deliver yet. Also, some of them are in relationship with the folks who are going to bring it. So I have a special relationship with this human who I met during my time at VLS, who recruited me every year that I was there to come to California. And I thought, well, I never did meet a lawyer I wanted to be like. So he asked me at the Iron Mountain Conference, which is an indigenous meetup in North Dakota and South Dakota. It's in the Black Hills. And we met because we were both drinking water that everybody bought that was poisoned. I learned a lot about the relationship of communities with the Army Corps of Engineers, as some of my classmates were going off to go work with them, and others were going other places. And we locked eyes on, but everybody just said this water is poisoned. Are we going to now drink it? Someone's going to pray over it, and now we're going to drink. This is the part where we're in the circle or we're out of the circle. And we locked eyes at, okay, I guess we're in the circle. So of the things that he brought to this work as a person who looks like him is understanding that it wasn't going to be delivered to him or through him, even if he wanted to do it. So he spent most of his career, every second of it, making sure that everything he knew was invested in other people. And then he delivered this message to white lawyers, which I think is deeply important. Because it's as true as the day that he said it, in the books that he wrote with Sheila Foster about it, all the ways that he worked through the system and helped many lawyers to do the work, is to recognize that the people we're talking to are not confused. They are not unclear on what's holding them back. They are as unclear as we are about what solutions are. And in some cases, they have experiments that are running at a faster rate than the ones we will do because we're entangled in a lot of regulatory frameworks. So Sheila Foster, who I mentioned, works in this town. She's the Scott K. Ginsburg chair at Georgetown Law. She works on global cities and climate work. She's an incredible human being who started working on the work of EJ and now is flagging that if cities do not work together on this work, all the money that flies out of the government is going to land nowhere. And we're going to have to start from scratch with a lot of messes. So I brought this conversation and weaved it in through my own story to talk to you a little bit about why environmental justice is not just a cool t-shirt that everybody gets to wear now. It is not a thing that is merely spiritual or merely about community. It is about the networks that we build to deliver change. The folks who are engineers in that space, who are working through the different technologies that it takes in people time to deliver good questions, to make processes better. And if we don't start to rethink environmental justice in this moment where it's getting a lot of resourcing, we won't show up when the money falls out of the IRA, the fastest money that's built into it, by the way. That money has to be spent before any other dollar is spent and before the other dollars even come in. How are folks who are facing all the things that we're talking about going to be able to do that unless really great people stand beside them and lend their credentials and do it without asking for credit? Harry Truman said a lot of things that we got to be careful about, but one thing he said that was really great was that it's surprising what you can get done when you don't care who gets the credit. And so that is the moment we're in, is that if you have capacity or space or energy to look at what's on your portfolio and have the ability to bring that to groups who are really trying over the long term to do justice over generations, which is how long it actually takes, you are in a position to help people scale up. It would be really great if all the smart people who went for the dollar could take a year off to just help folks deal with this bill. Why? Because unless we start to think about who's at risk when this money falls out of the government, it's all ungoverned capital, we really do risk an opportunity that just when we're close to change that could make the goals we share in common happen, people will run out of steam. They will burn out. And so that's a very real thing we should be concerned about, alongside it, whether or not we pick the right color of hydrogen to tell people is okay, which is just going to be a question that keeps coming up until we actually have an answer. So given that we're in this brand new day full of amazing things that are possible and can happen, I also think there's a lattice work forming underneath the administration that is pushing some of the big stuff so that smaller, more durable wins are possible. And so flagging that these things have come in the form of campaigns that are really loud, in the form of statements that people have read, in the form of dollars that have moved. Like, this is one of the most exciting things. Just the idea of Justice 40 means the federal government's own money moves right now. So that's not about what happens on Tuesday, because there's enough riding on Tuesday. But the idea that we can make these decisions now, move people's money, because it is the people's money, into a conversation about what works for us and what doesn't work for us, is about us not just understanding the technical differences between the ITC and the PTC, or what money's going to public lands and what money's going to broken pipes and fixes so that people don't just widen roads with federal money. But the idea that the solve for $27 billion in green banking isn't developing a new set of green banks, but maybe perhaps focusing on minority depository institutions and CDFIs and other things that already exist in communities that are real. So part of why I started where I started was to help everybody in the room understand we're not talking to people who are, my grandmother will call them unchurched or unhoused, even though both of those are just states of being, and she's dead, so I'm not going to explain it to her. But the idea being that we're talking to people who have networks, who have thought about this, who have made some decisions for themselves in manuals that they have written in whatever language you speak about the technical parts of this they're not interested in. So I don't think we're in a conversation with folks who need more data. They want to know why they should risk what they're already risking when their skin's already in the game to do it. And it's our job to say, not just these good, fun, great parts, but all the stuff that really will make you look. So all the things we've unleashed and enabled, all the ways that lattice work of law that I showed in the first couple of slides is slowly underwritten when NEPA is generally in danger of being able to do the work that it does on a regular basis because of politics. So we have so much on our plates, but it will start with us being very honest about what's hard about what we're doing. And I say this as someone who has risked a lot of my own capital in the work, like my own social capital, as a person who works in all the engines that were saying, it's so great. I was getting yelled at by people in front of the White House at the big do, who just like, we need to win the win. I'm like, no, we need to talk about what didn't work. Because the best way to lose people's confidence and trust is to lie. And so this was not a bill that any of us would have written. This is a bill we were delivered by a person who extracted a certain amount of flesh to do a political thing that if we talk to communities about that as though it were true, it would be the beginning of a conversation and not the end of it. Because what folks are asking for and what I've written in op-eds about and what people have talked about on podcasts is that they feel like the people they have been training for this moment with walked away from them so that they could be a big moment at COP. And until we deal with the reality of that being able to slam the global table and say America has done something came at a cost that will need to be repaired, we don't have enough people to accomplish the work. So these are the sorts of things that will help people with that. So things that they will feel at home, improvements to what happens in your car, and the way you get to work being less polluted, and money for schools, and things that go back into home energy rebates, again, assuming you are housed, like all the sorts of things that people will notice about the bill, that if we don't talk to them about what doesn't work, they will be skeptical and not even try this. So 2, 3, 4 jobs ago, I worked at the Maryland Energy Administration with Martin O'Malley, Abby Hopper, 2 folks who are really deep in this space in a lot of ways, very smart folks. And let me tell you, trying to give out $55 million a year in Maryland to people who don't trust the government means $55 million a year for experiments like these goes nowhere. Low to moderate income is the most stressful thing you can say to any program officer in any energy program in any state you're in, because we have not done the work to build the relationship it takes for people to accept help. Right now at Climate Critical Earth, we have a survey out, it's a climate burnout survey. And one of the questions that we asked that I'm so excited to get millions of answers on, or however many we get, is who would you take help from and why? Because it isn't just about us all having a light go on, but what are we gonna do to work to let people know this is not a trick? This is real. You can trust me, I have questions, but the only way we do that is by not pretending we know everything. So part of the ways we can mend fences to win the win is by doing a couple of things that I've learned from really smart people over the course of my career. One is Judith LeBlanc from Native Organizers Alliance says it very succinctly: practice our asses off. We need to practice our asses off. That's it. You can put it on your mirror in the morning. That we are not perfected in this work. There's lots to do. We have tons of open questions. If we take that practice and an appetite for potentially failing into a place of procedures and policies, we give people a chance to make some decisions and then undo them in the small amount of time that we have if it doesn't work, but we gotta try. Also, this is multi-generational work. Like a thing we do today is a thing we do today, but if it's in the policy or it's in the governance, it outlasts us. So that's multi-generational work that could be justice if we focus clearly on what we're doing together. Also, there are the folks who we have listened to not enough, or you wouldn't end up in moments like these, have their own ideas about things that we need to do. Reparations is not a conversation that's divorced from the conversation around energy and environment, because climate reparations requires people who will be forced to take on managed or unmanaged retreat to make decisions about where they're going to go next. Some of that should be undergirded by places where we have put in good infrastructure, where we've thought about where people are going to move, where we have energy grids that can serve a growing population as folks move around, and what Tony has described as rewilding becomes a reality for folks who are forced to leave fires and floods. Those are real things, but if we don't engage all of these, I'm sorry about the light, but all of the proposals in this slide have come from communities who have questions. And if it doesn't ever get taken up by people in great offices with beautiful views who work on tech or a specific part of regulation, it doesn't get refined either. So these are all ideas that if it's confusing or feels outside of the work, we really should try to marry to all this experimental money that's coming out of the government. Because other folks will be marrying into all kinds of things, especially if we're not working to be thoughtful about it. And the reason this matters to me is because all of these things are true about my community, all of them. Like, these are not theoretical questions about what climate change will do to us. Climate change is already here. If you're poor, if you're Black, if you're a woman, if you are queer, if you are any and all of those things, at the same time, you're deeply in it. If you live in the global South or the US South, which bears such a striking resemblance that it would be included except for, America. So we are in a moment where all of these true facts make it harder to show up in the conversations where we need more information, more data, more storytelling, more expertise, and more experience. So until this makes everybody else in this room as angry as it makes Black people, we're not there yet. And until you show up like an ally for all the folks for whom this is true, you cannot do effective work, no matter how much it pays. So I'm glad they asked me to come. I'm really uplifting, generally outside of this context. But I also think it's important to flag that why I'm raising this is because we are actually asking people for the bargain basement price of money to sacrifice their ecology, their spiritual relationships, their connectivity, their future, and then assigning them a ticket price for that by saying, you are poor. And so until I know in this particular crowd at this school, there are more folks who care about this than others. But that's why we're having this conversation, because it's really important that what you do today in this moment where we're in such a fragile space on climate actually is marry your technical capacity to that thing that your family probably doesn't understand that you do, to some work that's going to matter for everybody. Because when we have proof, more people will understand it. And some of the ways that you can start to practice that are power shifting and power sharing, and thinking about your amazing credentials as something that in service could do even bigger work. Recognizing that people's cultural expertise and language, their leadership styles, and the way they talk is a part of the currency in a place you're not in. Recognizing that even if we throw money onto people, I used to joke at 350 that I wanted us to be we used to be the kind of organization that would put money on the table at the end of the night. Like, we're gonna have this big mobilization, everyone come out. I said, I'd like us to be the kind of organization you could introduce your mother to, because we built a better relationship and we wanna be seen in the daytime doing our work, right? And so that's not just true of nonprofit organizations or any specific sector, but the government itself can be accused of this if all we do is release ungoverned capital into the space and expect people to figure it out with tools they never had, with expertise they've never been supported in, with partners they never did get a chance to build because it didn't make sense to invest in that right now. And I also want to lift up that along the lines of doing this, we have wasted so much time on climate, energy, and environment, but we are no longer in a space where we can build at the speed of trust. We actually have to build at the speed of alignment just to survive, and then talk about trust when we do that. So if you have skills that people need, invite yourself. Because the problem and your analysis of it is about as good an invitation as you're going to get from folks who are fighting all the stuff that I've been talking about. So just your daily reminder, this shows up on my phone every day, and I got to figure out some person who lives with me did this. So I thought I would share it with everyone. But this is the moment we're in, and if you would like to connect, I'm happy to talk here or anywhere else, and I will call it VLS, even though it annoys you, until I'm feeling better about it all. No, but seriously, we're just in a moment where there's a lot happening. And in the same way that people, quite frankly, could not understand why Vermont would open up a school that has a school in it that focuses on energy, when people see what it does, they will get there. When, like, showing up in a space and turning people's emotional space, their problems and their concerns into targets they can focus on, I have never had better organizers in any space I've been in, even though I do this for a living, than a community who knows who helps them solve their problems. So I encourage everyone here to keep doing what you are doing, but also to stop doing it alone. Because we need more people who think these things are the same work. And until we get there, we cannot win. Thank you. Sure.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. I'm pretty sure I should say something about the sponsors of this event, which I haven't said yet, but I want to definitely thank Bracewell for giving us this amazing space. And I saw Jason earlier. He couldn't be here because I think his wife is out of town and he's on kid duty. But they've been, Kevin, how many years has this been at Bracewell? Just 2? Oh, okay. Well, hopefully it continues. And then also my law firm has contributed Perkins Coie and has sponsored this, I think, since year one, but for a long time too. So, but obviously these events only work because people come out and people agree to sit on panels, and we have amazing speakers. So I think hopefully we can continue this. Next year is 10, so we should have some huge, even bigger party. But I want to also thank Kevin for organizing, and Brock. I don't know where he went, but for being the tech guru and making this whole thing happen. So with this, we have a reception. Do you know where it is, Kevin? Yeah, right around the corner. Hopefully everybody can make it. And is there anything else I'm supposed to do, Kevin?
I don't know if there were any questions for Tamara.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there's
Will
a...
that slide be available? There's a lot of information.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Nobody wants to stand in between. I saw it. No, nobody wants to stand in between, the crowd and getting drinks. So with that, this will conclude the 9th Annual Alumni and Energy Symposium. Thanks, everybody.